Hello everyone, I am the Crime Teller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. In the heart of Phnom Penh, beneath the surface of the city's rapid modernization and glittering skyscrapers, a shadow economy thrived, one built on desperation, deception, and suffering. The mastermind behind Cambodia's largest human trafficking ring was a man named Vaisal Dara. Born into a struggling family in the 1970s, he had spent his youth navigating the chaos left behind by war and instability. Unlike others who sought a better life through hard work and perseverance, Vaisal saw opportunity in exploitation. By the early 2000s, he had established himself as a powerful businessman. On paper, he owned a chain of textile factories and shipping companies that exported goods across Asia. But behind the facade of legitimate enterprise, his real fortune came from a much darker trade, smuggling people across borders, feeding an insatiable market for cheap labor and forced servitude. Vaisal was careful. His operation was layered in complexity, utilizing corrupt officials, forged documents, and an intricate web of transport routes. The people he trafficked came from villages in Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Thailand, many of them tricked with promises of high-paying jobs in factories, hotels, or construction sites. Others were sold into brothels, never to be heard from again. His power wasn't built on violence alone, but on fear and control. Those who worked for him knew that disobedience meant consequences, and those who crossed him vanished without a trace. For over a decade, he remained untouchable, expanding his empire as authorities struggled to piece together the true scale of his operations. It wasn't until 2016 that the first major crack in his network appeared. A shipment was intercepted at the border between Cambodia and Thailand, near Phoi Phet. The authorities expected to find illegal goods, contraband electronics, or drugs. Instead, they uncovered a hidden compartment in the back of a cargo truck. Inside were 42 people, packed together like livestock, barely able to breathe. Some were children, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies emaciated from days without food. The discovery sent shockwaves through the region. International agencies became involved, and for the first time, law enforcement had undeniable proof of large-scale human smuggling. They traced the truck's origin to a warehouse outside Phnom Penh, a property linked to one of Vaisal's shipping companies. But arresting a man like Vaisal Dara wasn't easy. The moment news of the truck spread, he disappeared. His businesses shut down overnight, his bank accounts were emptied, and his closest associates went into hiding. He had spent years preparing for this possibility, and when the time came, he slipped through the cracks like a ghost. For months, authorities searched for him. Rumors spread, some claimed he had fled to China, others believed he was hiding in the jungles of Laos. But the truth was far more shocking. Vaisal hadn't left Cambodia at all. He had simply changed his face. As the authorities scrambled to locate Vaisal Dara, his presence seemed to dissolve into the shadows of Phnom Penh's underbelly. He had anticipated the possibility of exposure for years, meticulously planning his escape in a way that no one would suspect. While investigators assumed he had fled abroad, he was closer than they realized, hidden in plain sight. Vaisal had long cultivated relationships with corrupt doctors who specialized in illegal medical procedures. Within days of the border bust in Phoi Phet, he had undergone reconstructive surgery, altering the sharp features that once made him recognizable. His nose was reshaped, his jawline softened, and his hair, once meticulously styled, was now shaved, revealing a different, unremarkable man. The scars healed quickly, leaving behind a face no longer matching the ones on international watch lists. His network of associates had not completely abandoned him. Some had disappeared, fearful of retribution or arrest, but others, deeply loyal to the empire he had built, remained at his disposal. They provided him with fake identification, an apartment in a nondescript district of the city, and, most importantly, a new business front. While his previous empire had relied on international smuggling routes, he now shifted focus to domestic operations, adapting like a predator evolving to avoid detection. Under his new identity, he began working as a middleman, connecting those still desperate for a way out of poverty with traffickers operating on a smaller scale. The routes were different, the stakes higher, but the core of the business remained unchanged. Humans were a commodity, and there was always a buyer. Meanwhile, the Cambodian authorities, with the assistance of international agencies, launched one of the largest manhunts in the region's history. Reports surfaced of trafficked victims who had managed to escape, sharing horrifying accounts of the conditions they had endured. Some had been forced into illegal fishing operations, working on ships that never docked, surviving on scraps as they labored endlessly on the open sea. Others were taken to cyber scam compounds, forced to work in fraudulent call centers where refusal meant beatings or worse. As the pressure mounted, those still loyal to Weissel found themselves targeted. One by one, his former associates were arrested, each leading investigators closer to the truth. A former lieutenant, captured while attempting to flee to Malaysia, revealed details about Weissel's altered appearance, breaking the case wide open. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. If Weissel hadn't left the country, then he was hiding in plain sight, possibly continuing his operations under a different name. Phnom Penh became a city under surveillance, checkpoints increasing, faces scrutinized. But Weissel was no amateur. He had anticipated this moment and had planned his next move accordingly. By the time investigators traced his alias to a newly established recruitment agency, they found an empty office, abandoned files, and another missing trail. He had vanished again. For months, the chase continued. The manhunt extended beyond Cambodia's borders, reaching into Thailand, Vietnam, and beyond. His empire had crumbled, his fortune drained, yet Weissel remained free, slipping through the cracks like water through fingers. But every predator, no matter how elusive, eventually makes a mistake. For months, Weissel Dara had evaded capture, a ghost slipping through the cracks of Southeast Asia's underworld. His face had changed, his empire had collapsed, but the instincts that had made him a mastermind of human trafficking remained intact. He understood people, their fears, their desires, their weaknesses, and he used that knowledge to disappear. The manhunt that spanned multiple countries had only served to make him more careful. Each step was calculated, each movement a part of an intricate game where the cost of losing was a lifetime behind bars or worse. Despite his fugitive status, Weissel had not abandoned the trade entirely. He had merely adapted, shifting from a large-scale operation to something leaner, more personal, and infinitely harder to detect. He had severed ties with anyone who could betray him and forged new ones with people who owed him nothing, nameless faces in the shadows of the underworld. These were smugglers who operated in smaller, fragmented cells, moving people across borders in ways that left little trace. He had learned from the mistakes of his past. The syndicate that once controlled entire shipping routes had collapsed under its own weight, too large to escape the scrutiny of law enforcement. Now, his new operation was decentralized, spread across various networks that barely knew of each other's existence. His role had shifted from a kingpin to a phantom, pulling the strings from behind layers of secrecy. The Cambodian authorities, however, had not forgotten him. They had seen too many broken families, too many children lost to the darkness of the trade, to let him go unpunished. Investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of intelligence from captured associates and rescued victims. They built a profile of his habits, his possible locations, his movements. International agencies joined in, tracking financial transactions, monitoring border crossings, analyzing patterns that might lead them to the fugitive. Yet Weissel always seemed one step ahead. He had become an expert in erasing his trail, avoiding digital footprints, and living off cash that could not be traced. He had abandoned luxury, residing in places where no one asked questions, where a bribe could buy silence. His appearance had changed again, this time through subtler means: weight loss, a change in posture, the adoption of new mannerisms. He could walk past the very men hunting him, and they would not recognize him. But even the most careful fugitives make mistakes. It was in Vietnam, in a remote border town, that a traffic survivor recognized a name, an alias that had slipped past investigators but not past those who had suffered under Weissel's operations. The survivor had been one of many, forced into a world of digital fraud, held captive in an apartment where escape was impossible. They had overheard conversations, caught glimpses of messages on screens, memorized details in case a chance to escape ever came. And when they did escape, they carried those details with them. The name was passed along, reaching law enforcement through a chain of whispers, each one adding a piece to the puzzle. Soon, a new profile was built: Weissel's updated identity, his likely whereabouts, his methods of communication. Investigators knew they were close. They moved quickly, setting up surveillance in the border town, watching for any sign of the man who had eluded them for so long. It was a waiting game, and patience was key. Days passed, then weeks, but eventually the trap was set. Weissel had become comfortable, believing himself untouchable once more. He had begun rebuilding his network, making new connections, slipping back into old habits. But he had underestimated the reach of those hunting him. One evening, as he entered a small cafe to meet a contact, he sensed something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the glances lingering too long. Instinct screamed at him to run, but before he could move, the room erupted. Officers closed in, weapons drawn, orders shouted in a mix of languages. For the first time in years, Weissel had no escape plan. There was nowhere left to hide. His arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal world. One of the most notorious traffickers in Asia had finally been caught, his reign of terror brought to an end. Survivors of his trade spoke out, their voices finally heard. Justice, long overdue, had arrived. But even behind bars, Weissel remained silent, his mind still working, still calculating. Because in the world he had lived in, even prison was not always the end. And somewhere, in the depths of the underworld, others were waiting to take his place. In the days following Weissel Dara's capture, the underground world of human trafficking in Southeast Asia was thrown into chaos. His arrest had sent ripples through the network, leaving operatives scrambling to cover their tracks, destroy evidence, and relocate before authorities reached them. Law enforcement had been quick to seize on the momentum, conducting raids across Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos, dismantling smaller cells that had once operated under Weissel's command. But the syndicate he had built was not a single entity. It was a sprawling web, and cutting one thread did not mean the whole structure would collapse. Weissel himself remained an enigma even in captivity. Interrogators found him cold, calculated, and frustratingly silent. He refused to answer questions, refused to acknowledge the weight of his crimes. Even when faced with survivor testimonies, he remained impassive, his expression unreadable. Some officers speculated that he was simply biding his time, waiting for the right opportunity. And they were right. While Weissel sat behind bars in a maximum security facility outside Phnom Penh, his remaining associates were already plotting. There was too much at stake, too much money, too many secrets, and too many people who could not afford for him to talk. The authorities knew this, which was why security was airtight. His prison cell was isolated, monitored around the clock. Every visitor was vetted, every letter reviewed, every interaction watched. But Weissel had not risen to power through brute force alone. He was a strategist, a man who understood human nature better than most. He did not need to escape on his own. He only needed someone on the inside willing to help. It started small, an officer who was struggling with debt, another who had a family member in need of medical treatment. Bribes were not offered outright. Rather, they were introduced as assistance, as solutions to problems that seemed otherwise insurmountable. Over time, the lines blurred. A favor here, a small oversight there. It was a slow erosion of integrity, one that Weissel orchestrated with precision. But outside the prison walls, authorities were not blind to the risk. They knew that a man like Weissel could not be left unchecked. International agencies were involved now, pushing for his extradition to face charges in multiple countries. They knew that time was against them. Every day that passed was another day his influence could spread. And then, one night, their worst fears came true. A power outage. For exactly 6 minutes, the prison plunged into darkness. Backup generators failed, an anomaly that was later determined to be the result of tampered circuits. By the time power was restored, Weissel Dara's cell was empty. The fallout was immediate. Borders were closed, airports were locked down, and roadblocks were set up across Cambodia. The manhunt that had taken years to bring him in had begun again, this time with even greater urgency. But Weissel had vanished. Authorities turned their attention inward, launching investigations into the guards, the prison administration, anyone who might have played a role in his escape. It did not take long to find the weak links. 2 officers who had mysteriously disappeared the same night, their families missing as well. A network of transactions was uncovered, money moving through accounts linked to shell companies in offshore locations. But money alone could not explain how Weissel had vanished so cleanly, so completely. There was something else, something deeper. Someone had orchestrated this from the outside. The question was, who? The answer came weeks later, not from law enforcement, but from an unexpected source. A survivor, one who had been trafficked years ago, whose life had been stolen by Weissel's operations, had recognized a pattern. She had spent years tracking names, mapping connections between the traffickers who had once held her captive. And now, she saw something familiar. A name, buried in financial transactions, linked to an old associate of Weisel's, a man who had disappeared from the scene long ago, presumed dead. But he was not dead. He was waiting. And now, with Weisel free again, the trade would continue. The fight was far from over. The search for Weisel Dara turned into an international pursuit, with intelligence agencies and law enforcement from multiple nations pooling their resources to track his movements. His escape had exposed the vast reach of his network, proving that even behind bars, his influence remained dangerously intact. Authorities were no longer just hunting a fugitive. They were unraveling a sophisticated criminal empire that had spent years perfecting its methods. Despite the lockdown on Cambodian borders and the intense scrutiny placed on any international travel, Weisel had seemingly disappeared into thin air. No security footage, no credible eyewitnesses, no confirmed sightings. It was as if he had simply walked into the shadows, leaving behind only the wreckage of his empire. But for those who knew him well, this was not surprising. Weisel had always operated like a ghost, preferring silence over spectacle, calculation over impulse. Weeks passed with no breakthroughs. Task forces in Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam worked around the clock, dismantling remnants of his operations, hoping that somewhere in the chaos, a mistake would be made. They raided suspected safe houses, interrogated known associates, traced bank transactions that led to offshore accounts. But still nothing. Every lead was a dead end, every informant too terrified to speak. But then, a break came from an unexpected place. A woman, thin and gaunt, walked into the Cambodian National Police headquarters in Phnom Penh. She spoke in a quiet voice, her eyes darting nervously as she recounted her story. She had been held captive for years, trafficked across borders, forced into an existence she barely survived. She had seen Weisel Dara before, not as a prisoner, not as a fugitive, but as a free man, sitting in the shadows of a hidden compound deep within the Cambodian jungle. She described a place that matched no known records, an estate surrounded by dense foliage, guarded by men with no uniforms but with weapons too advanced to be mere thugs. It was a place that should not exist, a fortress built in secrecy, away from the eyes of the world. And yet, it did exist. She had been there, and so had Weisel. Authorities wasted no time. Within hours, a specialized unit was mobilized, moving quietly, avoiding leaks that could tip off the traffickers' remaining allies. Aerial surveillance struggled to pinpoint the location, the dense canopy obscuring any clear images. The jungle was not just a hiding place, it was a natural fortress, one that Weisel had undoubtedly chosen for its ability to swallow secrets whole. The operation began at dawn. Helicopters hovered at a distance, drones deployed to scan the perimeter, soldiers moving in calculated steps through the jungle floor. They expected resistance. They anticipated a firefight, but what they found was far more unsettling. The compound was abandoned. Fires still smoldered in the pits. Bowls of half-eaten food sat untouched on wooden tables, documents scattered as if people had fled in a hurry. Someone had warned them. Someone had given them enough time to disappear, just as Weisel always did. But this time, he left something behind. A single, handwritten note sat on the desk inside what appeared to be the main building. It was written in Khmer, the ink still fresh. It read, "I told you, you will never find me." The weight of those words settled heavily on the investigators. Weisel was not just a fugitive. He was a man who had mastered the art of evasion. He had built an empire that could function without his direct presence, an empire that had now slipped into the shadows with him. The raids continued. Across Southeast Asia, suspected hideouts were dismantled, operations disrupted. But for every door that was kicked open, another one was sealed shut. Survivors were rescued, but the masterminds remained untouchable. The woman who had come forward disappeared days later. Authorities found her room empty, her belongings left behind as if she had never planned to leave voluntarily. There was no sign of forced entry, no trace of struggle. She was simply gone. The message was clear. Weisel Dara was still in control. Months turned into years, and his name faded from the headlines. New cases took precedence, new criminals rose in his absence. But those who had hunted him never truly stopped searching. They knew that somewhere in the depths of an unknown jungle, behind the walls of an undiscovered stronghold, the architect of one of the largest human trafficking rings in Asia was still watching, still waiting. And they knew that one day he would surface again. Years passed, but the ghost of Weisel Dara never truly disappeared. His empire had been shaken, its foundations cracked by the relentless pursuit of law enforcement, but it had not been eradicated. Like a hydra, Every severed head only seemed to give rise to another. The trafficking routes remained active, albeit more covert, shifting locations like shadows under moonlight. The jungles of Cambodia, once believed to be a sanctuary, no longer held the same power they once did. But the world was vast, and Weissel was not a man bound by borders. The task force dedicated to his capture had long since been disbanded, its resources allocated elsewhere. Reports of his activities dwindled, until they became nothing more than whispers in the underworld. Some believed he had been killed by his own men, a casualty of power struggles within the remnants of his organization. Others speculated he had changed his identity, slipped into another country, perhaps even walked among the wealthy elite who had once funded his operations. But those who truly knew Weissel knew the truth. He was still out there, watching, waiting, planning. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a chilling discovery was made. On the banks of the Mekong River, near the border between Cambodia and Laos, a group of fishermen stumbled upon a makeshift burial site. What they first thought to be another tragic victim of the river's current soon turned into something far more sinister. The grave was shallow, hurriedly covered, as if whoever had buried the bodies had done so in desperation. When authorities arrived, they uncovered dozens of remains, all showing signs of severe abuse. Forensic examination confirmed their worst fears. These were victims of human trafficking, their bodies discarded once they were no longer of use. Some had been dead for months, others only weeks. Among the remains, a single piece of evidence sent shivers through the investigators. A pendant, engraved with a symbol known only to those who had chased Weissel Dara for years. It was his mark. The discovery reignited a dormant investigation, pulling former agents and officers back into the fray. It was no longer just about capturing a fugitive. It was about stopping a cycle that had continued in the dark for too long. Survivors began to speak out once more. Women, men, even children, who had been trapped within a system they thought they would never escape. Many described the same horrors: forced labor, imprisonment, exploitation. But one testimony stood out from the rest. A young woman, barely in her 20s, had been found alive, hiding near the burial site. She was weak, dehydrated, but her mind was sharp. She spoke of a facility, hidden deep within the Laotian jungle, where people were brought and never seen again. A place where Weissel himself had been sighted only weeks before. She was the first person in years to claim to have seen him with her own eyes. The urgency to act became undeniable. Governments coordinated in secret, unwilling to let this chance slip away. Unlike before, there would be no warnings, no leaks, no mistakes. They would strike fast, with no room for error. The mission launched at dawn. Helicopters cut through the mist, soldiers moved with precision. The jungle was thick, almost suffocating, but they pressed forward. What they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. The facility was not just a holding site. It was an operational hub, a processing center where people were categorized, separated, and sent to destinations unknown. The captives they found were in dire conditions, many too weak to even speak. Rooms lined with steel bars, cages barely big enough for a person to sit in, documents detailing transactions as if human lives were nothing more than commodities. But Weissel Dara was not there. Once again, he had slipped away, vanishing just as the storm closed in. But this time, they had more than just empty rooms and discarded evidence. They had names. They had records of financial transactions. They had proof of his continued operations. The chase was no longer about catching a ghost. It was about dismantling every last piece of his empire until there was nowhere left for him to hide. For the first time, the world was closer than ever to bringing Weissel Dara to justice. But those who had hunted him for years knew, until the man himself was caught, the nightmare would never truly be over. Case 2. The name Caleb Hensley carried weight in the dark alleys and hidden corners of Maryland's criminal underworld. Born in 1973 to a working-class family in Baltimore, he had shown promise as a businessman from an early age. Yet, his hunger for wealth and power led him far from the path of legitimate success. By the early 2000s, he had built an empire, one that thrived on desperation and despair. Caleb was no ordinary smuggler. He was calculated, meticulous, and patient. Unlike many traffickers who relied on brute force and intimidation, he cultivated trust before exploitation. He created front companies, cleaning services, logistics firms, even small tech startups that served as pipelines for his true business, human trafficking. His network stretched across Maryland and beyond, reaching down to Florida and up toward the Canadian border. Under the guise of offering employment and new opportunities, he lured vulnerable individuals, immigrants seeking refuge, young people escaping poverty, and those who had nowhere else to turn. Some arrived willingly, desperate to believe his promises of a better life. Others were coerced, trapped in a system that did not care whether they lived or died. By 2012, his operations had reached an unprecedented scale. Authorities were aware of rising human trafficking cases in Maryland, but they had no idea how deeply embedded the problem had become. Victims arrived from all over the world: Mexico, El Salvador, the Philippines, even Eastern Europe. Many were forced into labor, cleaning luxury homes in wealthy neighborhoods, or working grueling shifts in restaurants and construction sites. Others suffered fates far worse, locked away in hidden apartments scattered across the state. Caleb's power lay in his invisibility. He rarely handled operations directly, instead employing layers of intermediaries, each knowing only fragments of the larger scheme. He was always a step ahead, keeping his name off any incriminating documents, and ensuring that those who worked for him remained disposable. If an associate was arrested, another would take their place within days. Yet, for all his caution, cracks began to form. The first sign of trouble came in 2013, when a woman named Marisol was discovered in a basement in Silver Spring. She had escaped through a rusted ventilation shaft after being held captive for nearly 2 years. Malnourished and terrified, she had managed to flag down a passing motorist, who immediately called the police. Marisol's testimony was harrowing. She had been promised a job as a housekeeper, but was instead locked in a small room, forced to work without pay and subjected to relentless abuse. She spoke of other women, some of whom had disappeared without a trace. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Activists demanded action, and law enforcement intensified their efforts. Yet, Caleb remained untouchable. His name did not appear in any of the recovered records, and those arrested refused to speak. They feared him more than they feared prison. But something had changed. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered. Federal agencies became involved, launching an extensive investigation into suspected trafficking routes. Over the next year, they uncovered a pattern: transported victims, unregistered properties, and money flowing through shell companies that led back to Maryland. The evidence pointed to a central figure orchestrating it all, but they still lacked a direct link to Caleb. Then, in late 2014, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A mid-level enforcer in Caleb's organization, a man named Travis Monroe, was arrested in a routine traffic stop. Found with false identification and a suspicious ledger, he quickly realized his options were limited. Facing decades behind bars, he made a decision few had dared before. He talked. Monroe's confession was explosive. He detailed how Caleb's operation functioned, from recruitment to distribution. He described hidden compartments in cargo trucks, coded messages between traffickers, and drop-off locations that had gone unnoticed for years. He gave investigators their first real look at the scope of the network. The hunt for Caleb Hensley intensified. Wiretaps, undercover operatives, financial tracking, every tool at the government's disposal was deployed. Finally, in early 2015, after months of surveillance, authorities executed a raid on a luxury waterfront estate in Annapolis. What they found was chilling. The estate was more than just a residence. Beneath the lavish exterior, hidden beneath reinforced walls, were quarters designed to hold people. Multiple individuals were discovered in varying states of distress, some barely able to speak, others too frightened to believe they had truly been rescued. But Caleb was gone. He had disappeared just hours before the raid, slipping away as if he had known it was coming. Some speculated he had received a warning. Others believed he had always maintained an escape plan. Regardless, the manhunt was on. For months, law enforcement combed the country, tracking leads from Miami to Chicago, yet he remained elusive. Then, in late 2015, an anonymous tip led authorities to a remote property in the Appalachian foothills. A tactical team moved in, surrounding the cabin where he was believed to be hiding. This time, there was no escape. Caleb was found alone, attempting to burn documents in a fireplace. He was arrested without incident, though his silence spoke volumes. He knew that no matter what he said, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The trial that followed was one of the most publicized in Maryland's history. Survivors testified, revealing the horrors they had endured. Financial records painted a picture of a man who had profited off the suffering of others for years. The prosecution left no doubt. Caleb Hensley was the mastermind behind one of the largest human trafficking operations the state had ever seen. In 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for many, the scars of his crimes would never fully heal. Families remained shattered, and some victims were never found. Caleb may have been brought to justice, but his legacy was a grim reminder of the darkness that could fester in plain sight. The case led to sweeping reforms, stricter laws, and a renewed commitment to combating human trafficking. Yet, even as the world moved on, those who had lived through it would never forget. Caleb Hensley sat in the cold, sterile courtroom, his face devoid of emotion as the prosecution detailed the full extent of his crimes. The air inside was heavy, thick with the weight of the suffering he had inflicted on countless victims. The jury listened intently, their expressions shifting between horror and disbelief. Survivors took the stand one by one, their voices trembling as they recounted the years of captivity, forced labor, and fear. Each testimony added another layer to the already overwhelming mountain of evidence against him. But Caleb never flinched. He never reacted. His silence was unnerving, as if he had already resigned himself to his fate. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping as they fed updates to the world. This was more than just a trial. It was a reckoning. The public demanded answers, justice, and above all, accountability. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? How had one man managed to orchestrate an empire of human trafficking without being detected? Questions swirled, and although authorities had finally captured the elusive mastermind, the damage had already been done. Families remained torn apart, and for many victims, justice could never truly undo what had been taken from them. The prosecution meticulously laid out the timeline of Caleb's crimes, starting from the early 2000s when he had first begun experimenting with illegal smuggling routes. Initially, his operations had been small, moving a few people at a time through concealed compartments and vehicles, hidden inside legitimate shipments. But as demand grew, so did his ambition. He began forging connections with corrupt officials, bribing his way through inspections, and establishing a network so intricate that it functioned like a well-oiled machine. By the mid-2010s, he was no longer just a trafficker. He was an industry leader in a criminal enterprise worth millions. His victims came from all corners of the world. Many were lured through false promises of jobs, education, or a fresh start in the United States. Once in his grip, they became commodities, stripped of their identities, their passports confiscated, their movements controlled. Some were forced into grueling labor in hidden factories, sweatshops, and elite private residences. Others were trapped in an even darker underworld, their freedom reduced to a mere illusion. Investigators had spent years trying to piece together the full scope of Caleb's operation, but it was nearly impossible. He had perfected the art of erasing his tracks, using layers upon layers of intermediaries to shield himself from scrutiny. He never used phones, never sent emails. Transactions were handled in cash, instructions delivered through word of mouth. By the time law enforcement had caught up, he had already destroyed much of the evidence, ensuring that even if he fell, the full scale of his empire would never be completely uncovered. But despite his best efforts, cracks had begun to show. The turning point came in 2013, when a survivor named Marisol managed to escape one of his hidden compounds in Silver Spring. Her account sent shockwaves through the country. She described a life of endless captivity, where women were rotated between locations, their existence known only to a handful of people. They were treated like inventory, not human beings. Some had been there for years, their families back home left to wonder if they were dead or alive. Marisol's escape ignited a firestorm of outrage, prompting federal agencies to pour resources into dismantling Caleb's network. What they uncovered was staggering. Properties linked to his businesses spanned multiple states, from Maryland to Florida, each containing evidence of illicit activities. Ledgers detailed coded transactions, marking payments for deliveries and inventory adjustments. Vehicles outfitted with hidden compartments were seized, their interiors showing signs of having transported people in inhumane conditions. Even with this overwhelming evidence, Caleb remained untouchable. His name did not appear in any official documents, and those arrested refused to implicate him. He had instilled a fear so deep that even when faced with decades behind bars, his subordinates chose silence over betrayal. But his downfall came not from law enforcement, but from within his own organization. In 2014, a man named Travis Monroe, a mid-level enforcer in Caleb's ranks, was arrested on unrelated charges. A routine traffic stop had uncovered forged identification, stacks of cash, and a notebook filled with cryptic notes. At first, Monroe refused to speak. He knew what happened to those who crossed Caleb, but as prosecutors piled on the charges, threatening him with a lifetime in prison, he cracked. His confession was the key authorities had been waiting for. He revealed the internal structure of Caleb's operation, the drop-off points, the hidden warehouses, the coded messages. He named names, pointing to the individuals responsible for specific routes and safe houses. Most importantly, he placed Caleb at the center of it all. With this information, law enforcement moved swiftly. Surveillance was ramped up, wiretaps were initiated, and financial forensics traced the flow of money back to Caleb's accounts. In early 2015, a coordinated raid was launched on his estate in Annapolis. What authorities found was a grotesque display of wealth, built on the suffering of others. Luxury cars lined the driveway, imported artwork adorned the walls, and a wine cellar worth millions lay beneath the floorboards. But beyond the grandeur, something far darker lurked. Hidden within the property were concealed living quarters, small, windowless rooms where captives had been kept. Locks reinforced from the outside, surveillance cameras trained on every door, ensuring that no one could leave without permission. The conditions were horrific, evidence of a system designed to break a person's will. But Caleb was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, slipping away just hours before the raid. Whether he had been tipped off or simply anticipated law enforcement's move remained unclear. For months, authorities scoured the country, tracing his last known whereabouts. Leads stretched from Miami to Chicago, yet each time they arrived, he had already moved on. His ability to disappear was almost supernatural, as if he had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. Then, in late 2015, an anonymous tip led them to a remote property in the Appalachian foothills. Surveillance confirmed a lone occupant inside, a man matching Caleb's description. A tactical team was assembled, surrounding the cabin in the dead of night. This time, there was no escape. When they breached the door, Caleb was found alone, desperately shoving documents into a burning fireplace. He did not resist, did not speak. It was as if he had already accepted the inevitable. The trial that followed was one of the most publicized in Maryland's history. Survivors testified in harrowing detail, exposing the horrors they had endured. Financial records painted a picture of a man who had built an empire on human suffering. The evidence was irrefutable. Caleb Hensley was the architect of one of the largest human trafficking networks the country had ever seen. In 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even as the gavel came down, many knew that his conviction was only a partial victory. The scars left behind by his crimes would never fully heal. Families remained shattered, and some victims were never found. Caleb's downfall led to widespread reforms, new laws, and a renewed commitment to fighting human trafficking. But the shadow he had cast over Maryland and beyond would linger for years to come. He was gone, locked away in a maximum security prison, but the echoes of his empire remained, a grim reminder of the darkness that could thrive in the most unexpected places. As Caleb Hensley sat in his cold, isolated prison cell, the world outside moved on. His name, once feared in the underground networks of human trafficking, had now become a cautionary tale in the fight against modern slavery. The walls of his confinement were bare, stripped of the luxury he had once surrounded himself with. The only sounds he heard were the echoes of other prisoners, the distant shouts of guards, and the occasional metallic clank of a cell door slamming shut. There were no more business meetings in lavish penthouses, no more coded phone calls to his lieutenants. His empire had crumbled, and he was left with nothing but time to reflect, though he rarely did. Outside, law enforcement continued their efforts to dismantle the remnants of his organization. Though Caleb had been captured, many of his former associates had gone into hiding, disappearing into the very shadows they had once used to exploit others. Some had fled the country, slipping through borders just as they had helped smuggle countless victims. Others remained within the United States, reinventing themselves under new identities, waiting for the dust to settle before attempting to rebuild. The federal task force assigned to the case had no intention of letting that happen. Over the next several years, they pursued every lead, tracking down former operatives, financial backers, and corrupt officials who had turned a blind eye in exchange for bribes. Each arrest was another step toward ensuring that Caleb's network would never rise again. Yet, for all their efforts, the scars left behind by his crimes ran deep. Survivors struggled to reclaim their lives, haunted by memories of captivity. Some had been reunited with their families, but the reunion was bittersweet. The years stolen from them could never be returned. They had left home as hopeful young dreamers, only to return as people forever changed by suffering. Some had been trafficked as children, and now faced the daunting challenge of learning how to exist in a world they barely remembered. One of those survivors was Marisol, the woman whose daring escape had set the wheels of justice in motion. She had spent years under Caleb's control, shuffled from one hidden location to another, never knowing if she would live to see the next day. When she finally found freedom, it took months before she could even speak about what she had endured. The nightmares didn't fade, and neither did the fear. But she refused to let Caleb define her story. She became an advocate, speaking publicly about the horrors of human trafficking, urging lawmakers to take stronger action. Her testimony at his trial had been one of the most powerful moments in the courtroom. She had looked directly at Caleb, her voice steady, unwavering. She described the cold, dark rooms where she and others had been held, the endless cycle of exploitation, the feeling of hopelessness. Caleb had remained impassive, showing no sign of remorse. But those in the courtroom had felt the weight of her words, and when the verdict was read, justice, though imperfect, had been served. But justice alone could not erase the past. In Maryland, law enforcement uncovered more hidden compounds long after Caleb's arrest. Some were abandoned, their captives long gone. Others still contained evidence of recent activity, proof that despite his imprisonment, the industry he had profited from continued elsewhere. The fight was far from over. Investigators also discovered secret bank accounts, offshore holdings linked to Caleb's operations. Despite their best efforts, millions of dollars remained unaccounted for, leading to speculation that some of his associates had managed to siphon funds before his capture. The idea that remnants of his empire could still exist sent a chill through those who had fought to bring him down. If even a fraction of his resources remained in play, then the cycle of trafficking could start anew. Meanwhile, in prison, Caleb adapted to his new reality. He was no longer a feared kingpin, no longer the mastermind behind an invisible empire. In the eyes of his fellow inmates, he was just another convict. Some respected his past power, but most saw him for what he truly was, a man who had built his fortune on the suffering of others. Unlike the gang leaders and violent offenders who ruled the prison's social hierarchy, Caleb had no one left to protect him. There were rumors that he had been attacked in his first year behind bars, an act of vengeance from an inmate who had lost a sister to his trafficking ring. Guards had found him bloodied, slumped against the cold tile of the communal showers, but he had refused to name his attacker. Whether out of pride or fear, he never spoke of the incident. He had built his empire on control, but now he had none. As the years passed, the world forgot about Caleb Hensley. New cases emerged, new criminals took his place in the headlines. The fight against human trafficking continued, an unending battle against those who sought to exploit the vulnerable. Caleb's name faded into obscurity, a footnote in the long history of crime in America. But for those whose lives he had destroyed, his legacy would never be forgotten. Somewhere in the quiet towns of Maryland, in the cities where his victims had been taken, in the homes of those who had mourned lost loved ones, his name was still spoken. Not as a figure of power, but as a symbol of darkness, one that they had fought to overcome. And in his prison cell, Caleb remained. The walls that confined him were nothing compared to the weight of what he had done. Though he would never admit it, though he would never show regret, he carried his own kind of sentence, one that no court could impose. The knowledge that the empire he had built with such meticulous care had crumbled to nothing. That no matter how much wealth he had once hoarded, no matter how many people he had controlled, in the end, he was just a man alone, forgotten and defeated. As Caleb Hensley continued to serve his sentence, the world outside moved on. Time inside prison was a monotonous loop, each day blending into the next with no distinction. The empire he had once ruled had collapsed, and whatever power he had wielded before was now useless within the cold walls of his confinement. He was no longer a kingpin, no longer feared, no longer relevant. The outside world had forgotten him, but the consequences of his actions continued to ripple across Maryland and beyond. Law enforcement agencies, determined to ensure that no trace of Caleb's empire remained, intensified their efforts. The investigation did not end with his arrest. It had only just begun. Federal agents continued to uncover hidden properties, offshore accounts, and encrypted communication logs, each revealing new layers of his criminal enterprise. What they found was staggering. Caleb had built a network so extensive that even with him behind bars, its remnants still posed a threat. Some of his former associates had gone into hiding, vanishing into the underground networks they had once used to smuggle victims. Others had been arrested, caught attempting to flee the country, or using falsified documents to assume new identities. The justice system worked tirelessly to dismantle every remaining piece of his organization, but the scale of the operation made it a daunting task. Meanwhile, the survivors, those who had endured years of captivity and exploitation, struggled to rebuild their lives. For many, the trauma was permanent. Some had been taken as teenagers, stolen from their families, and forced into a life of horror. Now, as adults, they faced a world they no longer recognized. Marisol, the woman whose escape had led to Caleb's downfall, became one of the strongest voices in the fight against human trafficking. She had been held captive for years, transported from one hidden compound to another, never knowing if she would survive the night. When she finally broke free, she refused to let her past define her. Instead, she used her experience to push for stronger laws, greater protections, and harsher punishments for traffickers. Her testimony during Caleb's trial had been a pivotal moment. She had stood in the courtroom, recounting the years of abuse, the fear, the hopelessness. She had spoken directly to Caleb, her voice unwavering, her words slicing through the courtroom like a blade. He had shown no emotion, no sign of remorse. But those who heard her story would never forget it. Even after the trial, Marisol continued to work with law enforcement, helping to identify other traffickers, exposing their methods, and guiding survivors through the difficult path of recovery. She knew that Caleb was only one piece of a much larger problem. Human trafficking was an industry that thrived in the shadows, fueled by corruption, greed, and the exploitation of the vulnerable. Despite Caleb's imprisonment, law enforcement discovered that some of his financial backers were still active. Wealthy investors, corrupt officials, and businessmen who had profited from his operations continued to operate in secrecy. These individuals had never set foot inside a trafficking compound, never physically harmed a victim, yet their money had fueled the machine that Caleb had built. Tracking them down proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation. One such individual was Richard Calloway, a powerful real estate developer in Maryland. He had publicly distanced himself from Caleb's empire, but financial records showed a different story. Hidden transactions, offshore accounts, and connections to shell companies all pointed to his involvement. He had laundered money for the trafficking ring, using his legitimate businesses as a front to clean the profits from Caleb's illegal trade. When federal agents confronted him, he denied everything. He had the best lawyers money could buy, and for a while, it seemed as though he might escape justice. But investigators were relentless. They followed the money, uncovering records that tied him directly to Caleb's network. In a high-profile trial, Calloway was finally convicted, sentenced to decades in prison. His downfall sent a clear message. No matter how powerful or untouchable someone seemed, the law would catch up to them. Meanwhile, Caleb's time in prison grew increasingly difficult. Without his wealth and influence, he was nothing more than another inmate. The respect he had once commanded had vanished, and in its place was the reality of life behind bars. The walls of his cell were unyielding, the days long and empty. His past meant nothing to the other prisoners, most of whom despised traffickers more than any other criminals. Rumors spread that he had been attacked multiple times, targeted by those who saw him as weak, despised by those who knew what he had done. The guards didn't care. To them, he was just another inmate, another name on a list. The power he had once wielded had disappeared, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his crimes. Years passed, and the world continued to move forward. New cases emerged, new criminals took Caleb's place in the headlines. But for the survivors, the pain remained. The scars left by his actions could never fully heal. Marisol continued her work, determined to make sure that no one else would endure what she had. She traveled across the country, speaking to lawmakers, advocating for stronger protections, working with law enforcement to dismantle trafficking networks. She refused to let Caleb's story be forgotten, not as a tale of power, but as a warning. And Caleb? He remained in his cell, a relic of a world that had left him behind. Forgotten by the public, abandoned by his former allies, stripped of everything he had once valued. The empire he had built had crumbled, and in its place was nothing but silence. Outside the prison walls, the fight continued. Human trafficking had not ended, but with each arrest, each survivor who found justice, the darkness was pushed back just a little further. The battle was far from over, but the victory against Caleb Hensley was a reminder that justice, though slow, would always come. Caleb Hensley had once believed himself untouchable. He had built an empire that stretched across Maryland and beyond, controlling a vast network of human trafficking operations that remained hidden beneath the surface of legitimate businesses and powerful connections. But the world had changed. His wealth had been stripped away, his influence erased, and the kingdom he had constructed had turned to dust. Now he was nothing more than a number in the federal prison system, a forgotten relic of a dark past that many wished to leave behind. His days in prison were long and uneventful. At first, he had tried to assert dominance, to cling to the illusion of power he once had. But the prison walls did not care who he used to be. The other inmates had no interest in his past glories. To them, he was just another man who had been caught, another criminal who had once thought he was above the law. They did not fear him, nor did they respect him. Instead, they saw him as weak, a trafficker, a man who had exploited the vulnerable for his own gain. And in prison, there was no lower form of existence than that. The guards offered no sympathy. They had seen men like him before, men who had spent their lives taking advantage of others, only to find themselves powerless when the system finally caught up with them. They knew his type, and they had no intention of giving him special treatment. If anything, they were harder on him than most, ensuring that he understood just how little his former status meant now. At first, Caleb had tried to fight back, to manipulate, to find some way to regain control. He had reached out to the few remaining contacts he had, those who had not yet been arrested or forced into hiding. But one by one, they abandoned him. No one wanted to be associated with a sinking ship. He had been valuable to them when he was free, when he had money and power. But now he was nothing, and so they cut ties, leaving him alone in a world he could no longer control. Outside the prison walls, the fight against human trafficking continued. Investigators had spent years unraveling Caleb's operation, uncovering the hidden financial channels, the secret transportation routes, and the corrupt officials who had turned a blind eye to his crimes. With each new arrest, another piece of his empire fell, another connection severed. The survivors, too, continued to fight. Marisol, the woman whose escape had led to Caleb's downfall, had become one of the strongest voices in the movement against trafficking. She had taken the pain of her past and turned it into a weapon, using her story to push for stronger laws, better protections, and harsher punishments for those who profited from the suffering of others. She refused to let Caleb's crimes be forgotten. She knew that there were others like him, men who still operated in the shadows, believing they were untouchable. And she was determined to ensure that they would meet the same fate as he had. The years passed, and the world moved on. The name Caleb Hensley faded from headlines, replaced by new stories, new crimes, new scandals. But for those who had suffered under his rule, the scars remained. Some tried to rebuild their lives, finding new purpose in advocacy, law enforcement, or simply in the act of surviving. Others struggled, haunted by the memories of what had been done to them. Caleb, meanwhile, grew older. The years in prison wore on him, stripping away the arrogance, the pride, the belief that he was somehow different from the other men who shared his fate. He had thought that his wealth and intelligence would set him apart, that he would find a way to escape the consequences of his actions. But time had proven him wrong. His health began to decline. The stress of imprisonment, the lack of proper medical care, the endless cycle of confinement, it all took its toll. The man who had once commanded an empire was now frail and weak, his body failing under the weight of years spent in captivity. And then one day it ended. Caleb Hensley was found dead in his cell, his body cold and lifeless, his face marked by the lines of a life spent in darkness. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, though some speculated that he had been murdered, a final act of retribution by those who had never forgotten what he had done. Others believed he had simply given up, that the weight of his past had finally become too much to bear. But in the end, it did not matter. Caleb Hensley was gone. His death was not mourned. There were no vigils, no outpouring of grief. The world did not pause to remember him. He had built a life on the suffering of others, and in the end, he had died alone, forgotten, his name little more than a footnote in the long history of crime and punishment. But the fight did not end with him. Marisol and others like her continued to push forward, knowing that there were still traffickers operating in the shadows, still victims waiting to be saved. They refused to let Caleb's crimes be repeated, refused to let another man rise to power in the way he had. They had seen the darkness, and they were determined to bring light to those still trapped within it. And so the battle continued. For Caleb Hensley, the story was over. But for the world he had left behind, the fight against human trafficking was far from finished. It had been years since Caleb Hensley had drawn his last breath in a prison cell, his empire crumbling into dust, his name erased from the annals of power. But his shadow lingered, stretching beyond the cold walls of his confinement, reaching into the places where his crimes had once thrived. The trafficking networks he had nurtured did not disappear overnight. They adapted, rebranded, and restructured under new leadership, just as they always had. The world had not changed enough to erase the dark trade entirely. For every trafficker who fell, another rose to take his place. The system, corrupt at its core, allowed men like Caleb to exist in the first place. As long as there was desperation, as long as there were those willing to exploit human suffering for profit, the cycle would continue. The institutions meant to protect the innocent were riddled with holes, gaps wide enough for new predators to slip through. One such man was Victor Langley. Langley had once been an underling in Caleb's organization, a shadow in the background, watching, learning, adapting. He had known that Caleb's time was coming to an end long before the authorities had caught up with him. Unlike his former boss, Langley had no illusions of invincibility. He understood that power was fleeting, that survival depended on reinvention. So, while Caleb had fought to hold on to a crumbling empire, Langley had been building something new, something smarter. He had severed ties before the arrests began, burning every bridge that could lead back to him. He had learned from Caleb's mistakes, studying every misstep that had led to his downfall. Where Caleb had relied on brute force and corruption, Langley embraced technology, using the anonymity of the digital age to his advantage. His operations were decentralized, faceless, operating in the dark corners of the internet where identities could be bought and erased with the click of a button. The new wave of trafficking was invisible to the untrained eye. It did not rely on dingy warehouses or back-alley deals. Instead, victims were lured through fake job postings, through promises of a better life, through the false security of social media. They were recruited, manipulated, and transported before they even realized what was happening. By the time they understood the truth, they were trapped in a system that had no exits. Marisol had never stopped fighting. Even years after Caleb's death, she had remained at the forefront of the battle against human trafficking, using her voice to expose the evolving nature of the trade. She had seen firsthand how the methods had changed, how traffickers had become smarter, more elusive. It was not enough to take down one man. The entire system had to be dismantled, root and stem. Langley knew her name. He had studied her, just as he had studied Caleb. He knew that she was dangerous in ways the authorities were not. She did not operate under bureaucracy, under the weight of slow-moving institutions. She was relentless, willing to go where others would not, to shine light into the darkest corners. And that made her a threat. For years, Langley had stayed in the shadows, moving his operations across borders, shifting identities, always staying one step ahead. But the pressure was mounting. Investigations were closing in, and Marisol was at the center of it. Her work had exposed weaknesses in his networks, disrupted his supply chains, forced him to abandon entire routes. He knew that he had two options: disappear completely or remove the threat. But Marisol was not afraid. She had spent too long in the darkness to be intimidated now. She had lost too much, seen too many victims suffer, to walk away. She understood the risks, knew that her work had made her a target. But she also knew that she was not alone. Survivors had become warriors. Law enforcement had grown smarter, more adaptable. Technology, once used by traffickers to exploit their victims, was now being wielded against them. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years there was hope. Langley would fall, just as Caleb had, and when he did, there would be another to take his place. But Marisol and those like her would be there, ready, waiting, refusing to let history repeat itself. Because the war against human trafficking was not won in a single battle. It was fought in the streets, in the courts, in the digital shadows where predators lurked. It was fought by those who refused to be silenced, by those who had once been victims but now stood as warriors. And as long as they stood, the traffickers would never be safe. Case 3. It was a world that most people never saw, a hidden undercurrent of despair beneath the bright lights of the Las Vegas Strip. Behind the towering casinos, the neon glow, and the ceaseless music, there existed a trade far older and far darker than the city itself. It was a trade built on broken promises and shattered lives, where people were not seen as human beings, but as commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded. And at the helm of one of the largest human smuggling rings in Nevada's history stood Vince Calderon. Calderon had grown up in the underbelly of Las Vegas, raised in a world where power meant survival and money was the only law that mattered. He was not born into wealth, nor did he inherit a criminal empire. He built it from the ground up, brick by bloody brick. Starting as a small-time hustler in his teenage years, he had quickly learned that drugs and weapons were not the most lucrative businesses in the city. Those markets were oversaturated, too volatile, too prone to attracting unwanted attention. But there was something far more valuable, something more easily hidden, something that no one wanted to talk about. People. In the shadows of the casinos and high-rise hotels, Calderon carved out his empire. His network spanned across borders, reaching into Mexico, Central America, and even Asia. He was not just a smuggler, he was a businessman. He understood supply and demand, and in a city where men with too much money and too few morals sought out the forbidden, he provided what they wanted. Whether it was underpaid laborers brought in under the guise of legal work, young women trafficked into the underground world of escort services, or desperate refugees who would pay any price for the illusion of safety, Calderon was the man who made it happen. His operation was seamless. He had built layers of protection, using shell companies, bribed officials, and encrypted digital transactions to ensure that no single thread could unravel the web he had woven. When Border Patrol cracked down on traditional smuggling routes, he adapted, finding new ways to move his human cargo. Shipping containers, private flights, and even underground tunnels, Calderon's network had an answer for every obstacle. But what made him truly dangerous was not just his intelligence or his ability to evade law enforcement. It was his absolute lack of conscience. To Calderon, human lives were just numbers on a ledger, assets to be moved and discarded when they were no longer profitable. He never met the faces of those he trafficked, never saw the fear in their eyes or heard their cries for help. To him, they were just another product, another deal waiting to be closed. For years, he operated in the shadows, untouchable. His fortune grew, his influence expanded, and his name became whispered in dark corners, both feared and respected. But no empire, no matter how meticulously built, could last forever. And Calderon's would begin to crumble in a way he never expected. The first cracks in his empire appeared not from law enforcement, not from rival criminals, but from within his own ranks. For years, Calderon had ruled with an iron fist, ensuring loyalty through a combination of financial rewards and brutal consequences. But greed and fear were never stable foundations, and eventually someone broke. One of his closest lieutenants, a man named Daniel Reyes, had always been loyal until he wasn't. Reyes had been with Calderon since the early days, had helped build the network, had ensured the money flowed without interruption. But what Calderon had never accounted for was guilt. Reyes had seen too much, had witnessed the horrors firsthand, and it had begun to eat away at him. The final straw came when he was tasked with overseeing the transport of a group of women from the Philippines. Women who had been promised jobs in hotels and restaurants, only to find themselves forced into a life they never agreed to. Reyes knew that this was his chance to do something. He couldn't erase his past, couldn't undo the things he had done, but he could stop this. He made contact with an undercover agent working with the FBI, feeding them just enough information to gain their trust. It was a dangerous game. One misstep, and he would be dead before he could say another word. But he was careful, methodical, ensuring that the pieces were in place before he made his move. The FBI had been watching Calderon for years, but they had never been able to gather enough evidence to bring him down. He was too careful, too well insulated from the crimes he orchestrated. But now, with an insider willing to cooperate, they had their opening. The operation to dismantle Calderon's empire was one of the largest human trafficking investigations in U.S. history. It spanned multiple states, involved dozens of agencies, and required months of planning. Wiretaps, surveillance, financial tracing, every possible method was employed to ensure that when they moved in, they would be able to take down not just Calderon, but his entire network. When the raid finally came, it was swift and brutal. In the early hours of the morning, federal agents stormed Calderon's various properties, seizing documents, arresting associates, and freeing dozens of victims. In a penthouse suite overlooking the Las Vegas Strip, Calderon himself was taken into custody, his empire crumbling around him. For the first time in his life, he had lost control. The trial that followed was one of the most highly publicized in Nevada's history. Survivors testified against him, painting a picture of unimaginable horror. Reyes, now in protective custody, provided key testimony that sealed Calderon's fate. When the verdict was read, there was no surprise: life without the possibility of parole. The man who had once believed himself untouchable would spend the rest of his days in a concrete cell, stripped of the power he had spent a lifetime amassing. But even as Calderon disappeared into the prison system, the scars he left behind remained. The victims he had trafficked would never truly be free of the trauma they endured, and the city that had allowed his empire to thrive would continue to grapple with the reality that human trafficking was not just a distant problem. It was here, hidden in plain sight, beneath the glittering lights of Las Vegas. And so the fight continued. The fall of Vincent Calderon sent shockwaves through the underworld of Nevada, but as the dust settled, it became clear that dismantling his empire was only the beginning. The FBI had arrested dozens of individuals connected to his operation, but the reality of human trafficking was far more complex than just removing a single leader. Calderon had built a network that was not just reliant on his direct control, but had become a self-sustaining machine. There were still operatives, enforcers, and brokers scattered across the country, some in hiding, others looking to reclaim what was lost. And in the aftermath of his arrest, a dangerous vacuum had formed, one that others were eager to fill. The investigation did not stop with Calderon's conviction. The agents assigned to the case, led by Special Agent Mark DeWitt, knew that there were still loose ends, bank accounts, offshore holdings, hidden properties that had yet to be seized. Calderon had been meticulous in hiding his assets, ensuring that even in the event of his downfall, his fortune would remain beyond the reach of law enforcement. The team worked tirelessly, sifting through encrypted messages, tracing wire transfers, and interrogating those who had been caught in the initial sweep. One of the key figures still unaccounted for was Elias Vega, a former cartel enforcer who had served as Calderon's second-in-command. Vega was a ghost, a man with no official records, no digital footprint, and no known residence. He had handled Calderon's security and ensured that anyone who threatened the operation disappeared without a trace. Now that his boss was in prison, Vega was in the wind, and intelligence suggested that he was regrouping. While the FBI was hunting Vega, another problem was beginning to surface. Some of Calderon's surviving associates were attempting to rebuild the operation under new leadership. It wasn't just about power, it was about profit. Human trafficking was a multi-billion-dollar industry, and there was too much money on the table for criminals to simply walk away. The network had been dealt a serious blow, but it was not destroyed. One of the most concerning developments was a shipment that had gone missing shortly before Calderon's arrest. A group of undocumented migrants, men, women, and children, had been in transit when the operation collapsed. The FBI had intercepted several shipments in the weeks leading up to the takedown, but this particular group had vanished. There was no record of where they had been taken, no indication of whether they were alive or dead. For the victims, time was running out. DeWitt and his team focused their efforts on tracking down the missing group, piecing together fragments of intel from phone calls, surveillance footage, and financial transactions. A breakthrough came when they discovered that one of Calderon's safe houses in the Nevada desert had been raided by an unknown faction shortly after his arrest. Whoever had taken over the operation had seized the remaining assets before law enforcement could reach them. As they followed the trail, it led them to an abandoned warehouse outside of Reno. It was a desolate, isolated location, perfect for those who wanted to operate unseen. When the FBI stormed the facility, they found a chilling scene. Cages, restraints, and hastily discarded documents that suggested the warehouse had been used as a temporary holding site. But the victims were gone. The captors had moved them before law enforcement could close in. With every lead they uncovered, it became clear that Calderon's arrest had not stopped the trade. It had simply made it more desperate, more reckless. The criminals who remained were not as careful as Calderon had been. They were making mistakes, leaving behind traces that the FBI could follow. But for every lead they found, there was another dead end, another missing piece. As the investigation continued, whispers began to surface in the underground networks. Someone was looking to take Calderon's place. A new name emerged, Diego Alvarado. A former trafficker from Central America, Alvarado had been operating in the shadows for years, watching, waiting. Now, with Calderon gone, he saw an opportunity to seize control. Unlike Calderon, who had prided himself on maintaining a polished image, Alvarado was ruthless. He had no interest in keeping a low profile. He thrived on chaos, violence, and fear. Alvarado's methods were brutal. He didn't just traffic humans, he made examples out of those who opposed him. Reports began to surface of entire groups of migrants being executed when ransoms were not paid, of women disappearing into the depths of the criminal underworld, never to be seen again. If Calderon had run his operation like a business, Alvarado ran his like a war. The FBI knew that stopping Alvarado would not be easy. He was not based in the United States. His network spanned multiple countries, making it difficult to track his movements. But there was one weakness they could exploit. Unlike Calderon, who had operated through intermediaries, Alvarado was known to be hands-on. He liked to oversee high-value transactions personally, and the FBI had intercepted intel that suggested he was planning a major deal in the coming weeks. A shipment of over 50 individuals set to be smuggled into the U.S. The operation to capture Alvarado would require coordination between multiple agencies, including Homeland Security and local law enforcement. Every detail had to be perfect. If they failed, Alvarado would disappear, and dozens more would be lost. The sting operation was set in motion. Agents posed as buyers, setting up a meeting with Alvarado's brokers. The location was a remote airstrip outside of Las Vegas, where private planes could land undetected. It was the perfect setting for a high-stakes transaction. Surveillance teams were stationed at key vantage points, ready to strike the moment confirmation was given. As the night of the deal approached, tension ran high. The FBI had only one shot at this. If they were discovered too soon, Alvarado would escape. If they moved too late, innocent lives would be lost. The agents waited in silence as the sound of an approaching aircraft cut through the stillness of the night. The plane landed smoothly, its cargo hold filled with human lives. And then, everything exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted as Alvarado's men realized they had been set up. The airstrip became a battlefield as agents engaged in a firefight with traffickers determined to escape. Alvarado himself attempted to flee, making a desperate run for a waiting vehicle. But the FBI had anticipated his move. A well-placed sniper shot took out the vehicle's tires, sending it skidding into the dirt. Alvarado was pulled from the wreckage, his reign of terror brought to an end in the very moment he thought he was about to rise to power. As the sun began to rise over the Nevada desert, the reality of what had transpired set in. The captives, frightened, malnourished, but alive, were taken into protective custody. The remnants of Calderon's empire had been shattered once and for all. And yet, for every victory, there was the sobering knowledge that the fight was far from over. Because human trafficking was not just the work of one man, or even one organization. It was a network, a system, a disease that thrived in the darkest corners of society. Calderon was gone. Alvarado was gone. But others would come, and the agents who had spent years battling this nightmare knew that their work was never truly finished. As Special Agent DeWitt watched the last of the survivors being led to safety, he knew that this was only one chapter in a much longer war. But for tonight, at least, there was a small victory. And sometimes, in a world as dark as this, that was enough to keep going. As the sun climbed higher over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows over the aftermath of the raid, the reality of what had just unfolded began to sink in. The night had been a violent one, a culmination of months of investigation, and while it had ended with Diego Alvarado in custody, the weight of the operation still loomed over the agents who had risked everything to bring him down. The captives, men, women, and children, were being processed by Homeland Security, their weary faces betraying the horrors they had endured. Some had been trafficked across multiple countries, sold and resold like commodities, while others had been lured under false promises of safety and prosperity. Now they stood in the unfamiliar landscape of Nevada, unsure of what would come next. Special Agent Mark DeWitt had seen many cases like this before, but something about this particular operation had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. Perhaps it was the sheer brutality of it all, the way Alvarado had treated human lives as nothing more than currency, his complete indifference to the suffering he inflicted. Or maybe it was the knowledge that despite everything they had done, the war was far from over. Calderon had fallen, and now Alvarado had been removed from power. But the machine that fueled human trafficking would not stop just because one more predator was in chains. The field office in Las Vegas was flooded with agents, reporters, and bureaucrats in the aftermath of the operation. The case had drawn national attention, and the FBI was under pressure to ensure that no loose ends remained. Every piece of evidence seized during the raid was being cataloged: laptops, burner phones, financial records. But the most chilling discovery had been made in Alvarado's personal ledger, a book filled with meticulous records of every transaction he had overseen. Names, ages, locations, prices. It was an account of human misery written in cold, clinical detail. One particular entry caught DeWitt's attention. It was dated just days before the raid and referenced a special shipment, one that had not been present at the airstrip. It listed 20 individuals, their identities unknown, marked with a symbol that had not appeared anywhere else in the records. A small, red circle. DeWitt felt a pit form in his stomach. Whoever these people were, they had been separated from the rest, sent elsewhere for reasons he couldn't yet understand. The thought of it sent a chill down his spine. Had they arrived too late? Had Alvarado already sold them off to another buyer? The FBI's victory was beginning to feel hollow. The weight of unfinished business pressed against DeWitt's chest as he turned to his team. "We need to find them," he said, his voice firm. "Before it's too late." The search for the missing 20 became the team's top priority. Analysts combed through the seized data, looking for any clue as to their whereabouts. The traffickers who had been arrested during the raid were interrogated, but none of them seemed to know. Or, if they did, they were too afraid to talk. Then, a breakthrough came in the form of a name, Santiago Mendez. He was a mid-level operative who had worked under both Calderon and Alvarado, but had managed to slip through the cracks when the FBI dismantled the network. He wasn't a boss, nor was he a high-value target, but he had been responsible for logistics, coordinating transport, securing locations, ensuring shipments moved undetected. If anyone knew where the missing 20 had been taken, it was him. Tracking Mendez down was no easy task. Unlike Alvarado, who had thrived in chaos, Mendez was cautious. He had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing, using multiple aliases and constantly changing locations. But the FBI had an advantage: money. One of their undercover operatives posed as a buyer, someone willing to pay a fortune for new merchandise. It didn't take long for Mendez to bite. The meeting was set at a secluded motel on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, a forgotten relic of a bygone era, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. Agents were positioned in nearby rooms, weapons ready, as the undercover operative walked inside to meet Mendez. The transaction was supposed to be simple, a discussion of business and negotiation. But Mendez, paranoid and desperate, made a fatal mistake. He saw something in the operative's demeanor that didn't sit right with him, a flicker of hesitation, a glance that lasted just a second too long. His hand moved toward his waistband, toward the gun he had concealed beneath his jacket. But before he could draw, the door burst open, and within seconds he was on the ground, a pair of handcuffs locking his wrists behind his back. Back at the field office, Mendez sat in an interrogation room, his face covered in sweat. He was cornered, and he knew it. He had seen what happened to people who crossed the FBI, and he had also seen what happened to those who betrayed men like Alvarado. "You're going to prison," DeWitt told him, his voice calm but firm. "That's a guarantee. But whether you spend the rest of your life there or walk out someday depends on you." Mendez hesitated. He had no love for Alvarado, no loyalty to the network. He had worked for them because it paid well, but now that life was over. He had only one card left to play. "There's a ranch," he finally said, "south of the border. That's where they took them. A location. A chance." It was all the FBI needed. The next 72 hours were a blur of coordination between U.S. and Mexican authorities. The ranch was heavily guarded, owned by a cartel that had long been involved in trafficking. It was a fortress, a place where people disappeared. If they didn't act fast, the missing 20 would vanish forever. The raid was set for the dead of night. A convoy of vehicles approached the property, agents moving with precision and silence. The compound was surrounded by high walls, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter. But they were not prepared for the full force of a coordinated strike. Within minutes, gunfire erupted, the night filled with the echoes of battle. DeWitt moved through the chaos, his heart pounding as he cleared room after room. Then finally they found them. Locked in a basement beneath the main house, 20 terrified souls huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. They had been days away from being sold, from disappearing forever into the abyss. The sight of them, malnourished, exhausted, broken, was a stark reminder of why they did this work, why they fought. As DeWitt and his team led them to safety, the reality of what had been prevented sank in. These were lives that had been saved, a small victory in a war that had no end. As the convoy pulled away from the ranch, the first rays of dawn painted the horizon in hues of gold and crimson. The battle against human trafficking would never be over, but for this moment, they had won. And sometimes that was enough to keep fighting. As the dust settled from the raid, and the rescued victims were processed by authorities, the true scale of the human trafficking operation became clearer. The ranch, hidden deep in cartel territory, had been more than just a temporary holding facility. It had been a marketplace, a hub where human lives were bartered and sold like cattle. Investigators combed through the seized evidence, piecing together the brutal reality of what had transpired there. Diego Alvarado might have been the mastermind behind the Nevada operation, but his network stretched far beyond state lines, beyond borders, beyond anything that could be dismantled in a single strike. He had built an empire on suffering, exploiting loopholes in law enforcement, bribing officials, and leveraging the darkest corners of human desperation. And even though he was now in custody, there were others, shadows waiting to take his place, ready to resume business the moment the authorities looked away. For Special Agent Mark DeWitt, there was no satisfaction in this victory. The faces of the rescued victims haunted him, their vacant stares, the bruises on their bodies, the silent terror still lingering in their eyes. These were the lucky ones, the ones who had been found. But how many others had slipped through the cracks? How many more were out there, trapped in places that had yet to be uncovered? In the following days, intelligence from the seized documents led to a series of smaller raids across the Southwest. Warehouses in Texas, safe houses in California, shipping containers in Florida, all tied back to Alvarado's syndicate. Each location uncovered more victims, more shattered lives, more evidence of the sheer scale of the operation. But one thing remained unanswered: the red circle. The symbol had appeared in Alvarado's ledger, marking the 20 individuals who had been separated from the rest. And as the FBI sifted through mountains of paperwork, they began to see a pattern. The victims marked with the red circle were young, primarily women and children. They had been handpicked, designated for something different from the others. Not just sold to criminal enterprises or forced into labor, but funneled into a network that was even more insidious. The deeper the FBI dug, the more horrifying the truth became. These individuals weren't being trafficked for traditional purposes. They were vanishing into the black market of illegal human experimentation. It was a conspiracy that stretched beyond cartels and traffickers, weaving into the dark underbelly of organized crime syndicates that dealt in forbidden sciences. Underground clinics, rogue doctors, and private investors willing to pay fortunes for untraceable test subjects. Some were taken for organ harvesting, others for illicit medical trials, experiments that legitimate pharmaceutical companies would never dare conduct within the bounds of the law. It was an industry fueled by secrecy, greed, and the absolute devaluation of human life. For DeWitt, this revelation was a nightmare beyond anything he had encountered. Alvarado had been a monster, but the people who funded these operations were far worse. They weren't just criminals, they were the kind of powerful individuals who operated in the shadows of society, untouchable by conventional law enforcement. Bringing them down wouldn't just require arrests and SWAT teams. It would require dismantling an entire hidden economy. But first, they needed to track the Red Circle victims. Mendez, now in protective custody, had provided useful intelligence, but he was only a middleman. He had arranged transports, handled logistics, but he didn't know the buyers. That information was reserved for higher-ranking operatives. And so, the FBI turned to another piece of evidence recovered from the Nevada raid: Alvarado's encrypted laptop. It was their last hope of uncovering the final destination of the missing 20. Decrypting the files took time. Layers of security protocols, self-destruct mechanisms, and advanced cyber defenses suggested that whoever Alvarado had been dealing with was no ordinary buyer. But after days of relentless work, the digital forensics team finally cracked it. The screen flashed with thousands of transaction records, names, locations, and encrypted communications. And then, buried deep within the archives, they found it, an address. It was a private medical facility located in a remote region of Mexico, officially registered as an off-the-grid research center. On paper, it was nothing more than an experimental clinic conducting trials for rare diseases. But the financial records told a different story. The facility had received millions in anonymous funding, with direct transactions tied to Alvarado's network. It was a front, a hidden laboratory where the Red Circle victims had been sent. DeWitt wasted no time. A joint task force was assembled, combining FBI agents, Mexican federal authorities, and specialized tactical teams. Unlike the Nevada raid, this mission was even riskier. The clinic was in hostile territory, protected by cartel enforcers and corrupt officials. A full-scale assault would be met with overwhelming resistance. They needed a different approach. Undercover operatives infiltrated the town surrounding the facility, posing as journalists, medical professionals, and local merchants. They gathered intelligence, mapped out security routines, identified key personnel, and what they discovered was chilling. The facility wasn't just a trafficking hub, it was a prison. The victims were held in underground cells, subjected to unknown procedures, their fates decided by doctors who saw them as nothing more than test subjects. The operation was set for dawn, when security was at its lowest. Using coordinated distractions, the task force moved in, breaching the facility's perimeter before the guards could raise the alarm. The compound erupted in chaos. Gunfire echoed through the halls as tactical teams stormed the underground chambers, encountering resistance from both cartel soldiers and armed medical staff. These weren't just doctors, they were complicit in the atrocities, willing to kill to protect their work. DeWitt led the charge into the lower levels, his heart pounding as he navigated the dimly lit corridors. And then, at the end of a cold, sterile hallway, he found them. The missing 20. The sight was enough to freeze his breath. They were strapped to medical gurneys, their bodies weak, their eyes filled with terror. For lines ran from their arms, hooked to machines monitoring their vitals. Some were conscious, others barely clinging to life. The air reeked of antiseptic and something darker, something that smelled like death. DeWitt moved quickly, unfastening restraints, calling for medics, assuring the captives that they were safe now. But even as the facility was secured, a gnawing feeling settled in his gut. They had found the victims, but the true masterminds behind this operation were still out there. The doctors who ran these experiments, the investors who funded them, the buyers who had placed the orders, they remained untouchable. As the FBI swept the facility, seizing evidence, DeWitt's eyes fell on a stack of documents left on a nearby table. Faded, blood-stained files detailing the experiments conducted within these walls. And at the top of each page, a single emblem, the red circle. This wasn't over. It had never been about just one operation, one trafficker, one facility. This was a system, a machine designed to consume and destroy human lives for profit. And for every Alvarado they put behind bars, another would rise to take his place. As the task force escorted the survivors out into the morning light, DeWitt knew that their fight had only just begun. The red circle wasn't just a mark in a ledger. It was a warning, a symbol of an enemy far greater than they had ever imagined. And if they were going to stop it, they would have to be willing to go deeper than ever before, into the darkness where justice had no reach, where the truth was buried beneath layers of power, secrecy, and blood. As the dust of the operation settled, the weight of the revelations pressed heavily upon Special Agent Mark DeWitt. He stood amidst the ruins of the underground facility, its cold, sterile walls now stained with the remnants of violence. The rescued victims were being transported to medical centers, their fragile bodies receiving the care they had been denied for so long. Yet, for every life saved, DeWitt couldn't shake the looming presence of the ones they had lost, the countless others who had vanished into the abyss of human trafficking, never to be found again. The red circle wasn't just a symbol. It was a network, a system so deeply entrenched within the fabric of organized crime that dismantling it would require more than arrests and raids. The true masterminds operated in the shadows, beyond the reach of conventional justice. These were not cartel bosses or street-level traffickers. These were individuals with power, influence, and wealth so vast that their existence was nothing more than whispers in dark corridors. As the FBI combed through the facility's records, decrypting files and cross-referencing transactions, one name emerged repeatedly, a name that had, until now, remained buried beneath layers of secrecy. Valerio Moretti, a figure shrouded in mystery. Moretti was believed to be a financier of illicit enterprises across multiple continents. Unlike Alvarado, who had built his empire on brute force and coercion, Moretti was a ghost. He operated through shell corporations, offshore accounts, and legal loopholes that made him virtually untouchable. He wasn't just funding human trafficking, he was profiting from it in ways no one had fully understood. The deeper DeWitt and his team dug, the more sinister the picture became. Moretti's investments weren't limited to the underground medical facility in Mexico. There were connections to research labs in Eastern Europe, pharmaceutical firms in Switzerland, and private security contractors with histories of war crimes. Every thread led to another, unraveling a web that stretched across borders, governments, and legitimate institutions. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, The victims marked with the red circle had been handpicked for experiments that went far beyond human endurance. Procedures designed to push the limits of genetic manipulation, neurological conditioning, and biochemical alterations. Some were sold to rogue scientific programs, others were used as living subjects for testing illegal substances. There were even rumors of clandestine military projects using trafficked individuals as disposable test cases for biological warfare advancements. For DeWitt, this wasn't just another case. It was a war, and wars were never won through arrests alone. With Alvarado behind bars and the Mexican facility dismantled, the FBI turned its attention to Moretti. But going after him was like chasing a phantom. He never stayed in one place, never left a digital footprint that couldn't be erased, and never conducted business directly. His name only appeared in coded messages, encrypted ledgers, and whispers among criminals who feared him more than the law. The only lead they had was a recurring transaction between Moretti's shell companies and a luxury estate in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The estate belonged to a reclusive billionaire, Leonardo Cavalli, a name familiar to intelligence agencies but never tied to criminal activity. Cavalli was a high society magnate, a collector of rare art, a patron of scientific advancements, and a known associate of political figures across Europe and South America. If Moretti had a safe house, a place where he felt secure enough to operate, it was here. The FBI coordinated with Interpol and Argentina's federal police, launching a covert surveillance operation. The estate was a fortress, high walls, advanced security systems, and guards who were ex-military. But the most chilling discovery was what lay beneath the surface. Satellite imaging and intelligence reports indicated that Cavalli's property wasn't just a mansion. It was built atop a sprawling underground complex, accessible only through secured tunnels. This was Moretti's sanctuary. If he was still in control of the red circle, this was where they would find him. DeWitt knew that a full-scale raid would be suicide. The estate wasn't just protected by security personnel. It was likely outfitted with counter-surveillance measures, escape tunnels, and enough legal barriers to make any direct intervention a political nightmare. They needed a way in that wouldn't set off alarms. That was when they received an unexpected break. A former employee of Cavalli's estate, a security consultant who had recently fled the country, came forward with critical information. He confirmed that Moretti had been present at the estate multiple times in the past year, always arriving under heavy protection. But more importantly, the consultant provided blueprints of the underground facility, detailed schematics that revealed hidden entrances, security blind spots, and most crucially, a vulnerability in the ventilation system that could be exploited. On a cold, moonlit night, a specialized FBI task force, alongside Argentine intelligence operatives, moved into position. DeWitt was among them, leading the operation from the field. Their objective was simple: breach the underground facility, extract Moretti, and dismantle whatever remained of the Red Circle's operation. Under the cover of darkness, the team infiltrated the estate's perimeter, avoiding security patrols and utilizing the ventilation system to gain access to the underground corridors. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. The deeper they went, the more the air grew stale, the scent of antiseptic and machinery filling their lungs. What they found inside was more horrifying than they had imagined. Rows of sterile rooms lined the corridors, each containing restrained individuals, hooked to machines monitoring their vitals. Some were sedated, others awake but too weak to move. The facility was still operational. Experiments were ongoing. And at the center of it all, inside a heavily secured chamber, sat Valerio Moretti. He was an older man, his presence exuding an eerie calm. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he did not resist as the agents stormed in, weapons drawn. He merely smiled, a cold, knowing expression that sent a chill down DeWitt's spine. "Do you truly think you've won?" Moretti's voice was almost a whisper, but it carried through the sterile chamber like a venomous echo. DeWitt didn't answer. He signaled his team to secure the facility, his focus never leaving Moretti's unflinching gaze. As they extracted Moretti and the remaining victims, the facility's hidden servers were seized, containing troves of classified data, transactions, communications, and research logs that detailed the extent of the Red Circle's operations. But DeWitt knew this was only a fraction of the truth. Moretti was just one head of a hydra, and cutting him down wouldn't end the syndicate entirely. Moretti's arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. The Red Circle's infrastructure crumbled, its operatives scattering in fear of exposure. Governments scrambled to cover up their unwitting involvement, distancing themselves from the scandal. The world saw it as a victory, a triumph of justice over evil. But for DeWitt, it was only a temporary reprieve. As he sat in his office days later, reviewing the files retrieved from the facility, his eyes fell upon one document that made his blood run cold. It was an encrypted ledger detailing future transactions, names, dates, locations. Moretti might have been in custody, but the business continued. Somewhere out there, in another hidden corner of the world, the red circle still existed. And as long as there were those willing to profit from human suffering, the fight was far from over. DeWitt closed the file, his jaw tightening. He had spent years hunting monsters, but the truth was some monsters never died. They simply changed names, shifted locations, and waited for the world to look away. And he would not let that happen. Not now. Not ever. DeWitt sat in his dimly lit office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the stack of classified documents before him. The weight of the recent operation still clung to his shoulders like a heavy shroud. They had taken down Moretti, one of the most elusive figures in the global trafficking network, but DeWitt knew better than to celebrate. The red circle was too vast, too deeply rooted to be eradicated with the capture of a single man. The decrypted files painted a chilling picture. Moretti was not just a financier. He was an architect, a strategist who had woven himself into the very fabric of illicit human trade. His influence stretched far beyond what DeWitt had originally believed, touching industries and institutions that should have been untouchable. There were records of contracts between the Red Circle and high-ranking officials, confidential agreements with powerful corporations, and coded communications with men whose names never appeared in public discourse. What disturbed DeWitt the most, however, were the future operations outlined in the files. Despite Moretti's capture, there were still active shipments, movements of trafficked individuals scheduled across continents. One in particular stood out, a transfer set to take place in Nevada within the next 72 hours. DeWitt's mind raced. Moretti's arrest was supposed to bring an end to this operation, yet here was proof that the machine continued to function without him. Someone else had already stepped in to ensure its survival, and DeWitt needed to find out who. The documents referenced a private airstrip in rural Nevada, owned by a logistics company that, on the surface, seemed entirely legitimate. But buried beneath layers of shell corporations was evidence that the company had been laundering money and facilitating covert shipments for over a decade. DeWitt wasted no time. He assembled a joint task force, coordinating with Homeland Security, the Nevada State Police, and undercover agents embedded in local law enforcement. This wasn't going to be a simple raid. They had a narrow window before the shipment disappeared into the vast network of underground trafficking routes, possibly never to be found again. The target location was a seemingly abandoned warehouse, situated near the airstrip, far from any major city. Satellite surveillance confirmed heavy security presence, armed guards patrolling the perimeter, surveillance drones monitoring the area, and a fleet of unmarked transport trucks positioned near the main loading dock. This was a hub, a central point where trafficked individuals were temporarily held before being distributed to their final destinations. If DeWitt and his team could shut it down, they wouldn't just be saving lives, they would be severing a crucial artery in the Red Circle's operations. But the risk was immense. The night was silent. The desert wind carried a faint chill as the convoy of black SUVs came to a halt half a mile from the airstrip. DeWitt and his team moved swiftly, dressed in tactical gear, their faces obscured by night vision helmets. The plan was to strike with precision, take out the guards, disable the surveillance systems, and secure the captives before they could be moved. The first team approached from the east, cutting through the perimeter fence with laser precision. Within seconds, they neutralized the guards, their silenced weapons ensuring no alarms were triggered. DeWitt led the second team through the loading docks, their boots silent against the concrete as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and something far more insidious, fear. Rows of shipping containers lined the interior, each one sealed shut, their walls dented with the desperate claw marks of those trapped inside. Some containers were already being loaded onto the trucks, their contents unknown, but DeWitt knew exactly what, or rather who, was inside. One by one, his team began to breach the containers, the locks shattering under the force of their hydraulic tools. The sight inside made even the most hardened agents falter. Dozens of captives, malnourished and terrified, huddled together in the dimly lit interiors of the metal enclosures. Some had been there for days, others for weeks, their voices hoarse from screaming for help that had never come. Many were children, their wide eyes filled with a mixture of hope and terror as the armed agents pulled them from their confines. But the operation was far from over. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out from the upper catwalk, followed by a burst of rapid-fire rounds. The remaining guards had been alerted. Chaos erupted as the warehouse was engulfed in a deadly firefight. DeWitt barely had time to react before bullets tore through the air, ricocheting off steel beams and shattering crates. He dove behind cover, returning fire as his team pushed forward, clearing the warehouse with ruthless efficiency. The guards were highly trained, their movements precise, their weapons state-of-the-art. This wasn't just a criminal operation. These men were professionals, former military or mercenaries, hired to ensure that no one left the facility alive. But they hadn't anticipated the relentlessness of DeWitt's team. One by one, the guards fell. The few that attempted to flee were met with intercepting units at every exit. Within minutes, the warehouse was secured, the last of the captives rescued. But something didn't feel right. As DeWitt moved through the wreckage, his eyes scanned the warehouse floor, searching for something, anything, that would explain why this operation had continued even after Moretti's capture. That was when he saw it, a door barely noticeable, concealed behind stacks of wooden crates. It was marked with no insignia, no warning signs, just a single number, etched into the steel, 0715. DeWitt's gut told him everything he needed to know. With a single nod, his team breached the door. Inside, the room was starkly different from the rest of the warehouse. There were no cages, no signs of struggle. Instead, there was a sleek, modern office, its walls adorned with high-tech surveillance equipment and server racks humming softly. And standing in the center of the room, completely calm, was a man DeWitt had never seen before. Unlike Moretti, this man wasn't old or frail. He was young, sharp, with an air of calculated detachment. He wore a tailored suit, his hands resting on the edge of a polished mahogany desk, as if he had been expecting them all along. "Special Agent DeWitt," the man said, his voice smooth, devoid of fear. DeWitt raised his weapon, stepping closer. "Who the hell are you?" The man simply smiled. "My name is irrelevant," he replied. "What matters is that you have no idea how deep this really goes." DeWitt's mind raced. If Moretti had been the architect, then this man was the engineer, the one who ensured the operation kept running, no matter the circumstances. And that meant Moretti's capture had been planned all along. The truth hit DeWitt like a freight train. Moretti hadn't been running the red circle alone. There was always someone behind him. And now, DeWitt had just found him. DeWitt's grip on his weapon tightened. His mind was racing, every fiber of his being screaming that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The man standing before him, calm and collected, wasn't afraid. That meant one of two things. Either he was bluffing, or he had a way out. DeWitt had spent years tracking men like Moretti, men who built empires on the backs of the helpless. He had seen fear in their eyes when the walls finally closed in. But this man was different. There was no panic, no desperation, just a quiet certainty that made DeWitt's stomach churn. "Your operation is over," DeWitt said, his voice steady. "Moretti is gone. The warehouse is secured. Your men are either dead or in custody. You're done." The man tilted his head, considering the words as if DeWitt had just made an interesting observation. "Done," he repeated, almost amused. "Agent DeWitt, you still don't understand, do you?" He took a slow step forward, his hands still resting at his sides. Unarmed, unafraid. "This wasn't my operation," the man continued. "Moretti? He was a useful asset, yes. But he was nothing more than a front, a distraction. You think you've won because you shut down a single hub? Because you captured one man." DeWitt said nothing. He let the man talk. "This is bigger than Nevada. Bigger than the red circle," the man continued. "You've disrupted one link in a chain that spans the entire globe. And while you celebrate your so-called victory, my associates are already replacing everything you destroyed tonight." His voice was calm, almost reassuring, and that terrified DeWitt more than anything. "You can arrest me if you like," the man said. "Take me in. Put my name in your reports. But it won't matter. There's another shipment tomorrow, and another after that. You won't stop it. You can't." DeWitt clenched his jaw, keeping his gun trained on the man. Every word felt like a knife twisting deeper. "Even now," the man added, "you don't realize what's happening." A sudden chill ran down DeWitt's spine. Then, his radio crackled to life. "Sir," an agent's voice came through, laced with panic. "Something's wrong. We're picking up." A deafening explosion tore through the warehouse, shaking the ground beneath them. DeWitt barely had time to react before a second blast erupted from outside, sending shockwaves through the walls. Alarms blared. The lights flickered, then died. Smoke billowed in from the corridor as distant gunfire erupted outside. They were under attack. The man before him barely flinched. He simply gave DeWitt a small, knowing smile. "I told you," he murmured. And then, before DeWitt could react, the man reached into his pocket. DeWitt fired. The gunshot echoed through the room as the man collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. But before DeWitt could even process what had happened, the entire warehouse erupted in chaos. Through the smoke and flashing emergency lights, DeWitt could see figures moving, armed reinforcements, pouring in from the airstrip. More men, more firepower. This wasn't just a cleanup crew. This was an extraction mission. Someone had known this raid was coming. Someone had planned for this exact scenario. DeWitt turned, sprinting back into the corridor as his radio filled with frantic voices. "Command! We're taking heavy fire, multiple hostiles, they're trying to wipe the site. We need immediate backup." No response. Then another explosion shook the walls. DeWitt didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, his only focus now on getting his team and the captives out alive. Because the truth was painfully clear now. This wasn't a victory. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Case 4. In the quiet town of Albury, nestled on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, the rolling hills and serene landscapes had long been a peaceful escape from the chaos of the cities. It was a place where life moved slower, where people knew their neighbors, and where crime rarely made headlines beyond petty thefts or bar fights. But in the year 2015, something far darker had been lurking beneath the town's picturesque exterior. Something so insidious that it would unravel one of the most extensive human smuggling operations in Australian history. At the center of it all was a man named Richard "Rick" Calloway, a businessman whose wealth and influence extended far beyond what anyone could trace on paper. To the outside world, he was a philanthropist, a real estate mogul, and a man whose presence at high society charity events seemed to solidify his status as one of Albury's most respected figures. But behind closed doors, Calloway was something else entirely, a man who had turned the desperation of others into a lucrative empire. His story wasn't one of a troubled childhood or a history of violence. He had been born into privilege, raised in Sydney's upper class, educated at the finest schools. But unlike others who used their fortune to build legacies of respect, Calloway had a hunger for something more, something unrestricted by laws or morality. He understood people, understood their desires, their fears, their weaknesses. And he understood that desperation made men easy to control. His operation had started small, almost undetectable. It had begun with the illegal movement of workers, men and women smuggled in from Southeast Asia under the promise of high-paying jobs in Australia's booming agricultural sector. They arrived on student visas or tourist permits, believing they would soon earn enough money to send home to their families. Instead, they found themselves trapped, their documents confiscated, forced into labor on isolated farms where their existence was nothing more than a transaction. But Calloway was not content with mere exploitation. By the time authorities began piecing together the truth, his business had evolved into something much larger, something more horrifying. He had built a network so vast and deeply embedded in legitimate industries that it seemed untouchable. Using a web of shell companies, freight businesses, and corrupt officials, he had created a direct pipeline for smuggling people not only into Australia, but also between hidden locations across the country. Authorities first began noticing irregularities in early 2014, when an unusual number of workers at regional farms were disappearing without a trace. Some of them had been reported missing by concerned locals. Others had simply stopped showing up for work, leaving behind wages they had never collected. When police investigated, the farm owners often had no answers. They just left, they would say. But something felt off. These were people who had nothing, no money, no transportation, no legal status. They had no reason to simply vanish. Then, in December 2014, a truck carrying a shipment of produce was stopped on the Hume Highway near Albury. The officers who pulled it over had only intended to conduct a routine inspection, checking for expired registrations, illegal cargo, the usual. But when they opened the back, they found something they were never meant to see. Inside the truck, hidden behind crates of fruit, were 17 people, men, women, even children, crammed into a sweltering metal container with no ventilation, no food, no water. Some were barely conscious. One woman, later identified as a Cambodian national, was moments away from death due to dehydration. It was a scene that sent shockwaves through the Australian Federal Police. This wasn't just illegal labor trafficking. This was something far worse. The investigation that followed was one of the most intensive in the country's history. Agents began tracing every lead, digging into the network that had allowed this operation to flourish undetected. What they uncovered was staggering. The smuggling routes weren't limited to farms. They extended into illegal brothels, domestic servitude, and even forced marriages. Victims were being shuffled across borders, locked in basements, threatened with violence if they resisted. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that this wasn't just Calloway's doing. He had built an empire on connections, powerful ones. There were whispers of government officials who had been paid to look the other way, of transport companies that had been used as unwitting couriers, of law enforcement agencies whose hands had been tied by bureaucracy. But Calloway himself remained elusive. By the time authorities moved in on his known properties, he was already gone. His homes had been emptied overnight, his accounts had been wiped clean. He had left behind no trace, no paper trail, no digital footprint. It was as if he had simply vanished into the very shadows he had operated from for years. Yet the story was far from over. What the authorities had uncovered was only the surface of something much deeper, something that reached far beyond the borders of Albury or even Australia. The people Calloway had trafficked weren't just victims of greed. They were victims of an entire system that had allowed this to happen. And as the days passed, one question remained unanswered. Where was Richard Calloway now? Authorities knew that Richard Calloway had built something far greater than a mere human smuggling operation. It was an empire woven into the very fabric of the system. The investigation that followed the discovery of the truck on the Hume Highway was relentless. But with each step forward, law enforcement encountered new obstacles, carefully placed barriers that hinted at just how deep this conspiracy ran. For months, federal agents combed through bank records, company filings, and surveillance footage. They raided properties linked to Calloway, seized assets, and interviewed former associates. Yet, time and time again, the same pattern emerged. Calloway had erased his tracks with meticulous precision. His offshore accounts had been emptied before they could be frozen. His mansions in Sydney and Melbourne were abandoned with nothing but silence filling their marble halls. But Calloway had not built his operation alone. There were others, figures who operated in the background, who ensured that the wheels of his empire continued to turn even in his absence. One such figure was Victor Liu, a Chinese-Australian businessman with ties to logistics companies that stretched from Australia to Southeast Asia. It was Liu's network that had facilitated much of the transportation used in Calloway's smuggling routes. Officially, Liu was a respected entrepreneur in the import-export business, his company specializing in food distribution and international shipping. But beneath the surface, his connections to organized crime were undeniable. When investigators turned their attention to Liu, they found a man who was both brilliant and ruthless. His warehouses were legal on paper, his contracts legitimate. But hidden among the stacks of documents were records that told another story. One of illegal shipments, of containers labeled as carrying agricultural equipment when in reality they carried human cargo. Raiding Liu's properties was a carefully coordinated effort. The Australian Federal Police, AFP, working with international agencies, moved in at dawn, hitting multiple locations at once. What they found was damning. Entire sections of warehouses designed for holding people, rooms filled with forged passports, and stacks of cash carefully organized in foreign currencies. But Liu himself was gone. Much like Calloway, he had disappeared before law enforcement could reach him. This was no longer a simple case of human smuggling. It was something more intricate, something more sinister. Calloway and Liu had created a system that thrived on desperation, a supply chain built on the backs of the vulnerable. And as authorities peeled back the layers, they began to see the extent of its reach. The victims were not just from Southeast Asia. They came from Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe. They had been promised safety, security, a future. Some had paid everything they had to men like Calloway, believing they would be given legal pathways to a better life. Others had been taken by force, their journeys beginning not with promises but with abduction. Those who made it to Australia rarely found what they were looking for. Instead, they were transported like livestock, locked in hidden compartments of shipping containers, smuggled across the country under cover of night. The lucky ones ended up in forced labor, their wages stolen, their movements controlled. The unlucky ones were sold into far darker fates, into industries that thrived in the shadows, into places from which few ever escaped. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to analyze the evidence recovered from Lou's warehouses. Computer hard drives, encrypted files, ledgers filled with coded transactions. It was slow, meticulous work, but as they cracked through layer after layer of hidden data, the full scale of the operation became clearer. One file, in particular, sent a wave of silence through the investigation team. It was a shipment manifest, dated just weeks before the discovery of the truck in Albury. The names were real, the destinations listed, the payments recorded down to the last cent. This wasn't just documentation, it was proof. Proof that hundreds of people had been moved through this system, each one assigned a value, a price. But there was one detail that stood out above all others. The final entry on the list was not just a name. It was a delivery date, and that date had not yet passed. The realization hit hard. This operation was still running, still active. Somewhere out there, more victims were already in transit, already locked away in the same suffocating conditions as those discovered on the Hume Highway. The authorities were not just looking at a cold case. They were racing against time to stop the next shipment before it disappeared into the void. It was a race that would take them deeper into the underworld of human smuggling than they had ever gone before. The investigation had shifted from uncovering past crimes to preventing an imminent atrocity. The existence of a shipment manifest with an upcoming delivery date sent waves of urgency through the task force. They had proof that another group of victims was already en route, likely being transported under the same inhumane conditions that had claimed the lives of those in the abandoned truck outside Albury. But there was a problem. There was no indication of where this shipment was heading. The task force, now involving multiple agencies including the Australian Federal Police, AFP, Interpol, and U.S. Homeland Security, knew that Calloway's smuggling network was not confined to Australia alone. His connections spanned continents, from the streets of Bangkok to the coastal cities of East Africa, from illegal sweatshops in the Middle East to the underground markets of Europe. This next shipment could be anywhere, and time was against them. Every agent working on the case was pushed to the limit. Digital forensics teams worked around the clock, decrypting Lou's seized hard drives, searching for clues hidden in terabytes of data. Financial analysts traced the flow of money through offshore accounts, hunting for any sudden withdrawals or transactions that might point to the next smuggling route. Undercover agents, embedded in Sydney's criminal underworld, leaned on informants, pressing for any scrap of intelligence. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. A coded email found on one of Lou's encrypted servers referenced a freight ship scheduled to depart from Port Botany in Sydney, bound for Malaysia. The manifest was vague, listing the cargo as non-perishable goods, a term often used to disguise human trafficking operations. It was set to leave in just 48 hours. For law enforcement, this was the break they needed. But intercepting a ship at port presented its own challenges. The criminal network had layers of security, and if Calloway's people got wind of an impending raid, they would simply abort the shipment, potentially disposing of the victims before authorities could reach them. The task force had to act without tipping off the smugglers. The plan was devised with surgical precision. Rather than storming the port with a show of force, a covert team was assembled. Disguised as dock workers, they infiltrated the shipping terminal under the cover of routine inspections. They carefully placed surveillance equipment, tracking movement near the targeted cargo containers. Snipers were stationed at vantage points, their scopes trained on any suspicious activity. As the hours passed, the tension was suffocating. Every flicker of movement was scrutinized, every truck entering the port was logged. Then, as night fell, the team spotted unusual activity near a stack of cargo containers. A group of men, dressed in high-visibility vests to blend in with legitimate workers, were securing a specific container with industrial locks. This was it. The signal was given. Silent precision was the priority. Special operations agents moved in, night vision goggles cutting through the darkness as they closed the distance. The smugglers had no warning, no chance to react. Within moments, they were subdued, restrained, and interrogated on site. But the true horror lay behind the thick steel walls of the container. As agents cut through the locks and pried the doors open, the stench of sweat, urine, and fear flooded out. Inside, nearly 60 terrified individuals were packed together, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Many had been inside for days, surviving on minimal food and water. Some were unconscious, their bodies unable to endure the suffocating heat and lack of oxygen. Medical teams were already waiting. As the victims were carefully extracted, their stories began to emerge. They had been promised work, safety, a future. Instead, they had been stripped of their passports, their identities erased, and sold like commodities. Some had been abducted outright, snatched from the streets of small towns and villages in countries thousands of kilometers away. Others had paid for passage, only to be deceived, trapped, and transported like livestock. It was a haunting scene, but it was not over yet. Calloway and Liu were still at large. As investigators combed through the intercepted shipment's documentation, they discovered an unexpected signature on a transit document, a name that had not appeared before in any of Calloway's previous operations. Someone new had taken charge of the smuggling network, a shadow even more elusive than the men they had been hunting. And this name led them somewhere no one had expected, a place where the line between legal business and organized crime blurred beyond recognition, a place where power protected those who pulled the strings, and a place where the fight against human trafficking was only just beginning. The name on the intercepted shipping manifest sent shockwaves through the task force. Marcus Whitmore, a respected entrepreneur, philanthropist, and owner of one of Australia's largest logistics and freight companies. On the surface, he was an admired figure in the business world, known for his contributions to infrastructure development and trade. He sat on advisory boards, mingled with government officials, and appeared in glossy magazines as the embodiment of success. But now, his name had surfaced deep inside a human trafficking operation, tied to one of the most heinous crimes Australia had ever witnessed. Whitmore's involvement complicated everything. He wasn't just a criminal mastermind lurking in the shadows. He was a public figure, someone with political ties and access to powerful circles. Arresting him without ironclad evidence would trigger legal battles that could drag on for years, and worse, if they moved too soon, he would vanish before they could touch him. The strategy had to change. Instead of taking him down directly, they needed to dismantle his entire network, piece by piece. Agents poured through every available document, searching for connections. Financial records, offshore accounts, hidden investments. Each thread led them deeper into a web of corruption that spanned continents. They discovered that Whitmore had been using legitimate shipping routes as a front for illegal cargo. By hiding smuggled individuals inside sealed refrigeration units or disguising them as temporary laborers, he had been trafficking thousands of people worldwide for years, undetected. It wasn't just about transporting victims. His empire included forged documentation services, fraudulent immigration schemes, and even bribed customs officials who looked the other way. Victims were funneled into forced labor camps, underground brothels, and sweatshops, never to be seen again. Those who resisted were disposed of, their bodies never found, their names erased. The scope of the operation was staggering, but the real challenge was proving it in court. Whitmore had lawyers, politicians, and law enforcement officers in his pocket. If they wanted to take him down, they needed to find a witness willing to testify. But who would dare? Among the rescued victims from the intercepted shipping container, there was one woman, Raya Singh. Unlike the others, she wasn't just another trafficked individual. Raya had been one of Whitmore's former recruiters, a woman who once lured desperate people into his system with promises of safety. She had seen everything, the bribes, the hidden warehouses, the abuse, but something had changed. She tried to escape. Her rebellion had cost her dearly. She was beaten, starved, and left to die in a cargo unit before being shipped off with the other victims as punishment. But she had survived, and now she was their best chance at taking Whitmore down. The problem was that Raya was terrified to talk. She had seen firsthand what happened to those who crossed Whitmore. People who spoke out disappeared overnight, found in abandoned mines, buried in remote deserts, or never found at all. She knew his ruthlessness, and she knew his reach. Even in police custody, she wasn't safe. The authorities had only one option: disappear her before Whitmore's men could. Under a new identity, Raya was moved to a secure facility in an undisclosed location. Every trace of her past was erased. Medical records, bank accounts, even her old photos were wiped from existence. But Whitmore knew. Despite the secrecy, the task force soon discovered that they were being watched. Agents reported unmarked vehicles trailing them. Encrypted messages intercepted their communication lines, and at one point, an anonymous package was delivered to their headquarters. A single bullet with Raya's original name carved into it. It was a warning. Whitmore was playing a different game now. He wasn't running. He was hunting. Within 48 hours, an assassination attempt was made. A hired mercenary disguised as a janitor managed to infiltrate the safe house where Raya was being kept. He was only stopped because of a last-minute security check, but the message was clear. No matter where they hit her, she wasn't safe. Time was running out. They had two choices: keep running or strike first. The task force changed their strategy. Instead of staying on the defensive, they set a trap. Using a decoy location, they spread false intelligence suggesting that Raya was being moved to a remote facility in Western Australia. Security teams, helicopters, and convoys were staged, making it appear like a high-profile operation. They waited. Then, on the night of the transfer, a convoy of unmarked SUVs descended on the fake location. Armed men, their faces concealed, stormed the facility, but they weren't met with a helpless witness. They were met with a fully armed tactical unit. In the chaos that followed, several of Whitmore's key enforcers were captured, and among them was the man himself. Marcus Whitmore, once an untouchable figure in high society, was now in handcuffs. But the fight wasn't over. As the world watched, his lawyers went to war, his allies scrambled to cover their tracks, and attempts were made to bury evidence before it could ever reach a courtroom. Even from behind bars, Whitmore held power, but for the first time, he was losing control. Raya Singh, the woman who had once feared for her life, stood before a jury, her voice steady as she exposed every secret, every crime, every name that had once thrived in the shadows. The largest human trafficking empire in Australian history was falling apart. But not everyone involved had been caught. As the trial unfolded, authorities realized that some of Whitmore's top operatives had disappeared. Bank accounts were emptied, properties were abandoned, and new smuggling routes were being established elsewhere. Even behind bars, the true scale of Whitmore's empire remained unknown. And somewhere out there, in another city, another port, another hidden room, a new leader was already rising to take his place. Even with Marcus Whitmore in custody, the war was far from over. His arrest had sent shockwaves through both the legal system and the criminal underworld, but it had also triggered something even more dangerous: a desperate scramble to erase any remaining evidence. The moment Whitmore was taken in, his network reacted like a wounded animal. Files were destroyed, safe houses were burned to the ground, offshore accounts were drained overnight. Some of his top enforcers vanished without a trace, disappearing into the very shadows they had once controlled. Others weren't so lucky, found dead under mysterious circumstances, their bodies dumped in remote locations as if to send a message. For the task force, this was expected. They had seen it before, criminal syndicates collapsing inward, trying to clean up their own mess before law enforcement could dig deeper. But what they hadn't expected was how far the corruption went. The deeper they pushed, the more disturbing the truth became. Whitmore hadn't built his empire alone. He had help from within the system. During a routine audit of seized evidence, an analyst within the AFP uncovered something alarming: a series of deleted transactions from a classified government database. It appeared that someone on the inside had been actively erasing records connected to Whitmore's operations. Someone was still protecting him. The task force had been compromised. It was a chilling realization. For months, they had believed they were one step ahead, dismantling Whitmore's network piece by piece. But now it was clear they had only been allowed to go this far. Someone within law enforcement, someone high up, had been helping Whitmore stay ahead of them. But Whitmore was no longer calling the shots. He had lost his leverage the moment he was placed in solitary confinement, cut off from the outside world. Whoever was still pulling the strings was working for their own survival now. And then a name surfaced. For weeks, the forensic team had been trying to decode the last remaining files recovered from Whitmore's private servers. These files had been heavily encrypted, far more sophisticated than anything else in his system. Whatever was inside, Whitmore had gone to extreme lengths to keep it hidden. When they finally broke through, what they found was not what they expected. The files contained a list of names, not just traffickers, smugglers, and corrupt officials, but business executives, law enforcement officers, and politicians. It was a ledger of every single person who had ever worked with, funded, or benefited from Whitmore's operation. And at the top of the list was Deputy Commissioner Alan Royce. Alan Royce was a high-ranking official in the Australian Federal Police. He had built his career on anti-trafficking initiatives, appearing on national television as a champion of justice. He had even been involved in public campaigns against modern slavery, standing alongside activists and politicians, pushing for harsher penalties on human smugglers. But now, the evidence was undeniable. Royce hadn't been fighting human trafficking. He had been managing it. For over a decade, He had been using his position to shield Whitmore's network from investigation. He had controlled what cases were prioritized, which raids were allowed to happen, and most importantly, which ones were quietly shut down before they could expose too much. He had played both sides, presenting himself as a hero while secretly profiting from the very trade he claimed to oppose. It was a betrayal so deep that even seasoned investigators struggled to process it. Royce had to be taken down carefully. A man in his position would see it coming the moment the investigation got too close. And if he ran, he had the resources to disappear completely, to a private island, a safe house in Switzerland, a country with no extradition treaty. But he didn't run. He thought he was untouchable. Using Whitmore's own encrypted files as evidence, the task force built an airtight case. They tracked his financials, uncovering millions in undeclared assets. Money funneled through fake charities, shell corporations, and offshore accounts. They connected him to classified case files that had mysteriously vanished, proving that he had personally buried investigations that got too close. And then they went public. Instead of quietly arresting Royce behind closed doors, the AFP held a press conference. They laid out every piece of evidence, exposing the depth of his corruption for the entire world to see. The reaction was immediate. Royce was forced to resign within hours, but it was too late. By the next morning, he was in handcuffs. With Royce out of the picture, the final remnants of Whitmore's empire collapsed. The few remaining operatives who had been hiding were flushed out, their safe houses raided, their financial networks dismantled. Dozens of traffickers, enforcers, and corrupt officials were arrested. More than 300 victims, some of whom had been missing for years, were found and rescued. It was the largest human trafficking bust in Australian history. But even as the trials began, the scars remained. For the victims, freedom did not mean forgetting. Many had been severed from their families, their identities stolen, their past lives erased. Some would never fully recover from what had been done to them. For the investigators, it was a hard-earned victory, but one that came with a bitter truth. In the months that followed, the world moved on. News outlets shifted focus to other stories, politicians claimed credit for the arrests, and new headlines replaced the old. But for those who had worked on the case, there was no illusion of finality, because Whitmore had not been the first, and he would not be the last. Human trafficking was a business, one that had existed long before Whitmore and would exist long after him. There would always be another trafficker, another corrupt official, another shipment of desperate souls waiting in the dark. And so the fight continued. For every victory, there would be another war. And in the hidden corners of the world, where laws meant nothing and human lives were treated as currency, the machine would keep turning, until someone somewhere was willing to burn it all to the ground. The world did not stop spinning after Alan Royce was arrested. The headlines had painted him as a monster, as the man who had orchestrated one of the most insidious human trafficking rings in modern Australian history. But for those who had worked tirelessly to dismantle the network, his downfall was only a single battle in a war that never truly ended. The days that followed his arrest were chaotic. Prosecutors scrambled to build an ironclad case, politicians distanced themselves from the scandal, and former associates of Royce began to disappear, either into hiding or worse, eliminated by those who feared they might talk. But even as Royce sat in a high-security cell, his influence had not yet been fully erased. Investigators were still poring over mountains of evidence, trying to track every dollar that had passed through his hands, every decision he had made that had allowed the trafficking ring to flourish. It was an overwhelming task. Years of corruption buried beneath carefully falsified records, erased data, and dead-end trails. But Royce had made a mistake. Like every man who believed himself untouchable, he had kept something for himself, an insurance policy, a failsafe. Perhaps he had feared that one day, even he might need leverage, and it was hidden inside a forgotten briefcase. The AFP had seized Royce's personal belongings the night of his arrest, his computers, his encrypted hard drives, his personal ledgers. But one item had slipped through the cracks. A black leather briefcase, stored inside a small storage unit under a false name. It was only found because of a single overlooked receipt, hidden in the margins of one of his financial documents. Inside, there were documents, hundreds of pages of them. Contracts, names, addresses, payment records. Evidence that went beyond even what the task force had imagined. This was not just about Australia anymore, because Royce's operation had been only a small part of something far greater. The documents in the briefcase revealed something chilling. Royce had been one of many. His network, his contacts, the shipments he had facilitated, They had all been part of a much larger machine. There were records of payments from overseas, encrypted communications between unnamed figures in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America. The trafficking ring wasn't just an Australian problem. It was global, and at the center of it all was a name that had never appeared before, a man known only as Virgil. There was no record of Virgil's true identity. No photographs, no fingerprints, no digital trail that tied him to any real-world entity. But according to the documents, he had been pulling the strings for years. He was the one who had connected Royce to international suppliers, the one who had arranged for high-value cargo to be smuggled through seemingly legitimate supply chains. He had personally overseen the disappearance of whistleblowers, ensuring that no one who threatened the operation survived long enough to expose it. And now that Royce was gone, it was Virgil who remained in control. The discovery of Virgil's involvement changed everything. The AFP was no longer dealing with just a domestic criminal case. They were hunting a ghost, a figure so deeply embedded in international trafficking networks that even his own associates had never met him in person. But there was one clue. Tucked within the documents was a single encrypted email, one that Royce had received just days before his arrest. The message was short, almost dismissive. Shut it down. No loose ends. It had been sent from a secure server in Dubai, and it had been signed simply V. The task force was suddenly operating under a new reality. Royce had been a powerful figure, but he had been replaceable. Virgil was the real mastermind, the one who had been watching from the shadows, ensuring that the trafficking ring continued to function no matter who was arrested, no matter which front was exposed. For weeks, agents worked around the clock, trying to trace Virgil's communications, following every digital breadcrumb that had been left behind. But every time they got close, the trail went cold. Whoever he was, Virgil knew how to erase himself. He was operating at a level beyond even Royce, a ghost among ghosts. And then, just as it seemed the investigation was reaching a dead end, something unexpected happened. An agent working on the Virgil case vanished without a trace. She had been following a lead, a potential informant who had claimed to have met Virgil once, years ago, in an underground auction in Macau. But the moment she left to meet her source, she never returned. Her car was found abandoned on a remote highway, her phone and personal belongings still inside. There was no sign of struggle, no clues, no messages. She was just gone. It was a warning, a silent message from Virgil himself. Stop, or disappear. The loss of their agent was a devastating blow. It was a reminder that they weren't just dealing with criminals. They were up against an organized system, one that operated outside the boundaries of law, morality, and even reality itself. Virgil was still out there. The network was still running, and nothing had truly ended. The media had moved on. The world had moved on. Alan Royce was locked away, his name already fading from public memory. But for those who had looked too deep, the war was still very real. And they knew one thing with absolute certainty. Virgil was watching, waiting, and the moment they got too close again, he would erase them, just like he had erased so many before. The days following the disappearance of the agent sent a shockwave through the Australian Federal Police. It wasn't just about one of their own vanishing. It was a message, a direct and chilling reminder that they were up against an invisible enemy, one who had operated in the shadows for years without ever being caught. But even more disturbing than the agent's disappearance was the complete and total absence of evidence. There were no security camera recordings, no signs of forced entry at her last known location, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious. It was as if she had been swallowed by the earth itself. The only clue, if it could even be called that, was an email received on her encrypted work account a full 24 hours after she went missing. It contained only 2 words. Not yet. No sender. No traceable metadata. No indication of whether it had come from her captors, from Virgil himself, or from someone else entirely. The discovery of the email left investigators divided. Some believed it was a taunt, a cruel psychological tactic meant to discourage them from continuing their work. Others believed it was something worse, a warning that they were being allowed to continue, but only up to a certain point. If Royce had been a soldier in the game, then Virgil was the architect of the battlefield itself. And Virgil had just made his move. With the investigation now under extreme pressure, the focus turned to those who had managed to survive Royce's network, victims who had been rescued, escaped, or left behind when his empire began to crumble. Many of them had never spoken about their experiences. Some had been so severely traumatized that even the mention of Royce's name sent them into a spiral of panic and fear. Others refused to believe that he was actually gone, convinced that even from behind bars, he still held power over them. And then, there was one survivor who finally broke her silence. She was a young woman, no older than 25, who had been trafficked through the network for years before managing to escape during a chaotic police raid in Darwin. Her testimony was unlike anything investigators had heard before, because she claimed to have seen Virgil. According to her, it had happened only once. She had been kept in a holding facility, a warehouse near the docks, its location unknown to her. The men who ran the operation were brutal, but they were terrified of something greater than themselves. And then one night, a man arrived. She never saw his face, but she felt his presence before he even entered the room. The guards, the handlers, they changed when he walked in. Men who had spent years breaking people down were suddenly meek, submissive. They barely spoke. They barely moved. It was as if they feared that even breathing in his presence might invoke his wrath. She never heard him raise his voice, never saw him engage in violence. But she saw something even worse. She saw his eyes, and for the first time in her life, she understood true, inescapable terror. She couldn't describe what made them different, what made them wrong. But she knew, in the deepest part of her soul, that whoever Virgil truly was, he wasn't like the others. He wasn't a trafficker. He wasn't a criminal. He was something else entirely. As weeks passed and no further leads surfaced, the investigation began to stagnate. The media had moved on. The government, eager to distance itself from a scandal of this magnitude, had begun to cut funding to ongoing efforts. And then one final message arrived. It came through an unsecured, anonymous line, delivered in the early hours of the morning to a senior investigator's phone. The message was short, direct, and terrifyingly clear. You know enough. Let it die. And this time, there was no signature. No trace. Just silence. The war wasn't over. It was just waiting for its next battle. Case 5. In the heart of Auckland's industrial district, beneath the facade of a legitimate international shipping company, existed one of the most elusive human trafficking rings ever uncovered in New Zealand's history. The mastermind behind it was a man known to the criminal underworld only as Dmitry Novik, a former Belarusian national who had built his empire in the shadows, moving people like cargo across borders without a trace. Novik was no ordinary trafficker. Unlike many in the trade who relied on brute force and intimidation, he operated with a level of sophistication that made his network nearly untouchable. He was fluent in multiple languages, held passports from at least 6 different countries, and had cultivated a network of corrupt officials that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. He didn't just smuggle people, he orchestrated an entire ecosystem of exploitation, feeding forced labor into industries that relied on undocumented workers who could never speak out. For years, his operation ran seamlessly, hidden beneath layers of legitimate businesses, untraceable financial transactions, and a ruthless hierarchy where even those closest to him never knew his full reach. The victims were desperate souls, lured by false promises of work and security. They came from war-torn regions, from countries where poverty had stripped them of hope. They arrived in New Zealand thinking they had found a second chance, only to be swallowed by the machine Novik had built. But in 2022, a single mistake unraveled everything. It started with an abandoned fishing trawler, discovered drifting off the coast near Christchurch. The boat had been stripped of identifying marks, its engine barely operational, its hull carrying no cargo, except for 14 people locked in a hidden compartment beneath the deck. They were malnourished, dehydrated, and terrified beyond words. Some were too weak to stand. Others bore the marks of restraint, bruises on their wrists, evidence of prolonged captivity. But what stunned investigators wasn't just the condition of the survivors. It was what they found in the ship's log. Handwritten coordinates. A set of names. A shipment schedule that pointed to something far bigger than an isolated case of human trafficking. And a single, chilling notation in a language that only a handful of specialists could decipher. A name. Dmitry Novik. The chase had begun. The discovery of the abandoned trawler off Christchurch's coast set off a nationwide investigation, unlike anything New Zealand law enforcement had ever faced. What had initially seemed like a stranded vessel, carrying desperate migrants, soon unraveled into a complex network of human trafficking that stretched far beyond the country's borders. The survivors, once strong enough to speak, painted a grim picture of the horrors they had endured. They had been promised safe passage, legal work, and a chance at a new life, but instead, they had been crammed into the dark belly of the ship, enduring weeks at sea with little food or water. Some of them had been held captive long before their journey even began, trapped in makeshift holding facilities scattered across Southeast Asia, waiting to be smuggled into countries they knew nothing about. New Zealand's Maritime Border Command, along with Interpol and local police, launched a full-scale operation to trace the origins of the vessel and the people behind it. The logs recovered from the ship, though damaged by salt water and neglect, provided just enough clues to start piecing together the truth. There were references to a warehouse in Auckland's industrial zone, coded messages exchanged between European and Asian syndicates, and encrypted bank transactions leading to offshore accounts registered under various shell companies. At the heart of it all was a name investigators had only heard in whispers, Dmitry Novik, but catching him would be anything but simple. Dmitry Novik was an enigma, a man who had never officially existed in any legal database. His true origins were unclear. Some intelligence reports suggested he was Belarusian by birth, raised under the shadow of organized crime syndicates that had flourished in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Others claimed he had spent time in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, learning the trade of smuggling long before he set foot in the Pacific. What investigators did know was that he had spent more than a decade operating in the shadows, building an empire that trafficked thousands of people across continents, laundering millions through crypto transactions and untraceable banking networks. His ability to evade law enforcement wasn't just because of his wealth or influence. It was his obsession with anonymity. He never used the same alias twice. He never stayed in one country longer than necessary, and he never trusted anyone completely. Those who worked for him had never seen his real face, never heard him speak directly. Orders came through third parties, encrypted channels, and anonymous couriers. The man himself was a ghost, a myth, a name whispered in the dark corners of the criminal underworld. But now, for the first time in years, he had made a mistake. Among the names listed in the trawler's log, there was one that stood out. It wasn't a victim or a buyer. It was a facilitator, a mid-level operative who had been responsible for securing fake documentation for the smuggled migrants. His name was Anton Raskovic, a Serbian national known to Interpol for his involvement in passport forgery and human trafficking. Raskovic had always been careful, but in the weeks leading up to the shipment's departure, he had taken a risk. He had personally withdrawn funds from a flagged account, an account tied to one of Novik's shell companies. That one transaction was enough to connect the smuggling operation to a larger network, exposing a trail of payments, false identities, and offshore laundering schemes that all led back to a single destination: Auckland, New Zealand. With enough intelligence gathered, a joint task force of New Zealand police, Interpol, and federal agents moved in on what they believed to be one of Novik's major safe houses, a seemingly ordinary warehouse on the outskirts of Auckland. From the outside, it looked like a logistics hub, complete with shipping containers and freight trucks coming and going at all hours. But inside, authorities uncovered a horrifying reality. Dozens of undocumented individuals were being kept in cramped, unsanitary conditions, awaiting their final transport to destinations unknown. Many had no idea where they were, nor what was about to happen to them. Authorities found forged passports, weapons, and encrypted ledgers detailing transactions between buyers and traffickers across multiple continents. More disturbing than that was the presence of young children, some of them too young to understand why they had been taken. But Novik was nowhere to be found. It was clear that someone had tipped him off before the raid, allowing him to disappear, just as he always did. What investigators didn't know yet was that this time, he had left behind something he never had before. A trail. A small but crucial mistake that would change everything. For years, Dmitry Novik had operated without leaving a trace. His movements were ghostly, his communications were coded, and his money moved through a labyrinth of offshore accounts that even the most skilled forensic accountants struggled to untangle. Yet, this time, something had gone wrong. The Auckland raid had not only dismantled a major trafficking hub, but had also unearthed an encrypted drive that, for reasons still unknown, Novik had failed to retrieve before fleeing. The drive was highly secure, layered with military-grade encryption, but for the first time in over a decade, authorities had something tangible that could be directly linked to him. Inside the drive was a series of hidden financial records, detailing cryptocurrency transactions, payments to corrupt officials, and shipping routes that crisscrossed the Pacific. More importantly, it contained a list of safe houses, one of which was in Queenstown, New Zealand. Unlike the other facilities, disguised as warehouses, abandoned factories, or fishing ports, this one was different. It wasn't a storage unit for trafficked individuals or a falsified document production center. It was a luxury residence, complete with underground security systems, panic rooms, and an extensive surveillance network. It wasn't just a location for business. It was personal. If Novik had truly operated from there, it meant the authorities were closer to him than ever before. A team of elite law enforcement agents, including officers from New Zealand's Special Tactics Group, STG, and Interpol's Trafficking Task Force, began surveillance on the property. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary luxury estate, owned by an anonymous shell corporation linked to a Hong Kong-based investment firm. But beneath the surface, there were subtle signs that this wasn't just another high-end retreat. The motion sensors around the perimeter weren't standard. They were military-grade, capable of detecting even the slightest movement from great distances. The security cameras weren't the type installed by ordinary homeowners. They were custom-built, remotely accessible from multiple locations. Most telling of all, the electricity usage was highly irregular. There were spikes in activity at odd hours of the night, patterns that suggested frequent encrypted communications and data transfers. Someone was using this place, and not just for leisure. The agents knew they had one shot at catching Novik. If they moved too soon, he could vanish like he always had. If they waited too long, he could wipe every trace of his existence and resurface in another part of the world. It was a waiting game, a battle of patience and precision. Days into the operation, intelligence analysts monitoring the area picked up an anomaly. A highly encrypted satellite transmission had been detected from within the estate. It wasn't an ordinary phone call or an internet signal. It was something far more sophisticated. It was a data burst, a compressed package of information being sent to an unknown recipient. Despite the encryption, forensic specialists were able to analyze its metadata, revealing a destination in Vladivostok, Russia, a known haven for international fugitives and a city controlled by powerful Eastern European crime syndicates. If Novik was trying to arrange an escape, it meant one thing. He was still in Queenstown, and he was running out of time. At 3:42 a.m., the decision was made. With night vision equipment, thermal imaging drones, and a silent entry strategy, the team moved in. The goal was clear: secure Novik alive. He was too valuable, too dangerous to eliminate outright. Breaching the estate was not easy. The entrances were reinforced, and the inner rooms were fortified with biometric locks. But nothing could hold back a tactical unit trained for high-risk extractions. When the first team entered, they found what they expected: a state-of-the-art command center, filled with burner phones, falsified documents, and encrypted communication systems. But Novik was gone, or so it seemed. It wasn't until one of the officers noticed a subtle disturbance in the flooring, a section of the hardwood that felt different underfoot. A hidden passageway, one that led to a tunnel system beneath the estate. Novik had built himself an escape route, a final contingency for when everything else failed. The tunnel was dark, narrow, and damp, running beneath the rugged terrain of Queenstown's outskirts. Novik had planned well. There were multiple exits, designed to throw off pursuers. But this time, he wasn't fast enough. Thermal drones picked up his movement. The tunnel walls were lined with motion sensors, allowing the team to track his every step. Novik had always been a planner, a man who stayed ahead of everyone else. But this time, he had underestimated his opponents. As he neared the far exit, he found himself surrounded. Armed officers stood at every possible escape point, blocking his path with tactical precision. For the first time in his life, Novik was cornered, and there was no way out. His arrest was swift. For a man who had spent decades avoiding capture, there was no struggle, no final act of defiance. Novik simply lowered his head, as if he had always known that this moment would come. But his capture was only the beginning. What followed was a global investigation, leading to the dismantling of his vast trafficking empire, the freezing of hundreds of millions in illicit assets, and the arrest of over 200 accomplices across multiple continents. Novik himself was extradited, facing a historic trial that exposed the full extent of his crimes. His network had crumbled. His empire was no more. And for the thousands of victims who had suffered under his rule, justice had finally been served. The trial of Dmitry Novik was unlike anything New Zealand had ever witnessed before. It wasn't just a case of international human trafficking. It was the largest criminal enterprise ever exposed within the country's borders. The courtroom was packed with journalists, international observers, and law enforcement officials from Interpol, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and multiple intelligence agencies. They had all gathered to witness the downfall of a man whose network spanned continents, a man who had eluded justice for nearly 2 decades. As Novik entered the courtroom, flanked by heavily armed officers, there was a hush that fell over the spectators. His face, once always hidden behind layers of security and digital anonymity, was now exposed to the world. The years of running had left their mark. His skin was pale from lack of sunlight, his sharp eyes dulled from exhaustion, yet there was still an unmistakable arrogance about him. It was as if he believed, even in this moment, he still had control. The case against Novik was airtight. The prosecution, led by one of New Zealand's most relentless Crown prosecutors, James Holloway, laid out the horrifying details of Novik's empire. Through the decrypted files found in Queenstown and testimony from former associates who had turned against him, a chilling story unfolded. Novik's operation had smuggled over 8,000 victims across 4 continents, using a sophisticated web of corrupt officials, fake maritime records, and underground routes through Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. His victims, many of whom had disappeared without a trace, were either sold into forced labor, sex trafficking, or indentured servitude under inhumane conditions. Some had perished along the way, either from malnutrition, abuse, or the harsh conditions of their captivity. Novik's lawyers, some of the most expensive defense attorneys money could buy, argued for reduced charges. They claimed that Novik himself never harmed anyone directly, that he was simply a businessman who had facilitated movement for individuals who knew the risks. But the evidence was undeniable. Satellite imagery confirmed trafficking routes through the Pacific. Digital forensics revealed transactions worth hundreds of millions, linking Novik to a global network of organized crime. The most damning of all, however, were the survivor testimonies. One by one, victims who had been rescued took the stand. They recounted stories of unspeakable horror. Children separated from their families, women promised jobs only to find themselves trapped in underground brothels, men forced to work in illegal fishing operations without food, rest, or medical care. A woman named Isla Fernandez, who had been trafficked from the Philippines to work in a fake textile factory in Australia, spoke through tears about how her younger brother had been taken from her and sold to another network. Another survivor, Koji Tanaka, who had been forced into labor on an illegal deep-sea fishing vessel off the coast of New Zealand, described the brutal beatings he endured for attempting to escape. The stories were so harrowing that even the most hardened law enforcement officials in the room struggled to keep their composure. Novik, however, remained expressionless. Not once did he look at his victims. Not once did he show remorse. After months of legal battles, the verdict was finally read. Guilty on all charges. Novik was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole, to be served in a maximum security prison in New Zealand before possible extradition to multiple other countries seeking justice. The moment the sentence was delivered, there was no reaction from Novik. He simply adjusted his suit, exhaled, and gave a slight smirk, as if the world had simply become another chessboard he had to navigate. But outside the courtroom, his empire was collapsing. With Novik behind bars, law enforcement agencies worldwide began dismantling his network piece by piece. Interpol froze millions of dollars linked to his offshore accounts. New Zealand authorities raided properties and businesses tied to his syndicate. Dozens of corrupt officials, from border officers to government workers, were arrested for aiding his operations. The message was clear: Novik's reign was over. But justice came at a cost. Many of his victims would never be found. Many had perished in the shadows, buried in unmarked graves or lost in the vastness of the sea. For them, there would be no closure, no final act of justice. But for the survivors, for those who had endured the darkness and lived to tell their story, Novik's imprisonment meant something more than just a legal victory. It meant that monsters like him were not invincible. It meant that the world was watching. And it meant that, for the first time in decades, the silent voices of the lost were finally being heard. As the days passed after Novik's conviction, the world slowly began to absorb the weight of what had transpired. News outlets across the globe ran continuous coverage, dissecting every detail of the case. Documentaries were already in production. Governments held emergency meetings to address the weaknesses in their immigration policies, border security, and international cooperation. But for the victims and those who had fought for justice, the battle was far from over. Novik's sentencing may have signaled the end of his personal reign, but his empire had left scars that would never fully heal. In the weeks that followed, Interpol and the unwind launched one of the largest international operations in modern history, aimed at tracking down the remnants of Novik's network. Arrests were made across Asia, Europe, and the Pacific, from the corrupt border officials who had turned a blind eye to the suffering, to the financiers who had funded the criminal enterprise. Many former associates had already gone into hiding, burning identities, erasing digital footprints, and cutting ties with each other in a desperate attempt to avoid capture. But the world had changed, the intelligence community had evolved, and technology now worked in favor of the law. Encrypted messages that once protected Novik's network were now being decrypted. Accounts that had once been thought untouchable were now seized. The pursuit was relentless. There would be no escape for those who had profited from human suffering. Novik in isolation. Locked away in New Zealand's most secure prison, Novik had become a ghost of his former self. In the beginning, he had refused to acknowledge the reality of his situation. He had spent years maneuvering through the shadows, believing himself untouchable, a man above the laws of any nation. Now he was nothing more than a number in the system. No longer was he surrounded by luxury, power, and influence. Instead, his world had been reduced to 4 concrete walls, a steel bed, and a locked door that would never open for him again. There was no empire left to control, no loyal subordinates to call upon, no network to manipulate. He was completely alone. For the survivors, the fight was now about rebuilding. Many would never fully recover from the nightmares they had endured. Some would live with physical scars, others with wounds too deep for the world to see. But one thing was certain, they were no longer voiceless. Governments across the world had been forced to reckon with their failures. Laws were rewritten, immigration systems tightened, and international task forces strengthened. Human trafficking had been exposed on a scale never before seen, and because of that, the world had changed. It was far from over. There would always be new threats, new criminals, new Noviks lurking in the shadows, waiting for their turn. But now they would know. No matter how powerful they believed themselves to be, justice would always come for them in the end.